drawn from his hand earlier was only meant to break her seal. It shouldn't have been nearly enough sustenance for a vampire who had been slumbering for thousands of years. Was she testing him, he wondered, waiting to see how he would respond? Ah, well, Eric mused, his grin widening. I was offering only out of courtesy. He shrugged, casting a final, dismissive glance at Iran. It seems his blood will go to waste after all. With a slow, deliberate motion, Eric raised his hand. The wooden staff faded from his grip, replaced by the gleaming worm-spire sword staff, its blade gleaming ominously in the dim crypt light. He held Serena's gaze, his smile never faltering as he unsheathed the blade, letting it catch the flickering torchlight. Without breaking eye contact with her, he drew the blade across Iran's neck in one smooth, unhurried motion. A dark line appeared, and blood began to pour forth in a thick, slow stream. Surtr and Heelrith released their hold on him, and Iran crumpled to the ground, the life draining from him in swift, crimson pulses. His eyes, wide with shock and fury, fixed on Eric in a final, silent scream. Yet the paralysis held, trapping him in the stillness of death. Eric gave a casual flick of his blade, sending droplets of blood scattering onto the cold stone floor. He turned back to Serena, his expression unfazed, even as the life he'd just taken bled out at his feet. Now then, he said with an untroubled smile, I believe you had some questions. Serena took a measured breath, her gaze wavering as she looked at the blood pooling on the floor. She then turned to Eric. The easy cruelty he had shown, a dispassionate act executed with almost playful calm, spoke volumes about the kind of man he was. Dangerous, certainly, but perhaps also useful. She folded her arms across her chest, her crimson eyes narrowing slightly as she fixed Eric with a measured gaze. Then I'll ask again. Who are you? And who sent you here? Her tone was cool but laced with curiosity, like she was trying to unravel a puzzle just beyond her understanding. Eric's smile widened, a glint of amusement in his eyes. My name is Eric Deathsong, he replied smoothly, his voice laced with a dark charm. I am many things: a mage, a wanderer, a man driven by curiosity, but, for the purposes of this conversation, let's say I'm a necromancer. He gestured toward Surtr and Heelrith, who loomed silently at his side, their towering forms casting long shadows against the dim stone walls. As you can see, I'm rather skilled in my craft. Serena's eyes flickered between the two undead servants, her expression unreadable. That explains the familiarity I sensed, she said, studying Eric with a new intensity. You're not just any necromancer, are you? There's something distinct about your aura. Something that reminds me of my mother. Eric chuckled, intrigued by the unexpected comparison. I don't know who your mother is, he replied, amusement dancing in his eyes, but I'll take that as a compliment. She must be quite the formidable lady. Serena's face softened just a fraction, a hint of a smirk playing at the corner of her lips. You could say that. She tilted her head slightly. But that still doesn't explain why you're here. If no one sent you, then you came of your own accord. Eric inclined his head, his expression growing more guarded, yet still playful. Precisely. I find ruins of ancient power to be irresistible. And when I heard whispers of a sealed tomb containing one of the most ancient vampires in Tamriel, just thinking about the stories you could tell is enough for me to make the effort. Serena nodded slowly, as if weighing his words, though her guarded expression didn't waver. I can't tell if you're lying, she murmured, almost to herself. But if your intentions were harmful, I doubt you would have gone through the trouble to awaken me, then slaughter this man right before my eyes. She studied him for another beat, her gaze piercing. Then, what is it you want from me? And, who is your unfortunate friend? She gestured towards Iran, his lifeless body still sprawled on the floor where Eric had left him. Eric raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk pulling at his lips. I've indulged a few of your questions, so perhaps it's only fair if you answer some of mine first. His tone was light, but his gaze was sharp, unyielding. Serena's eyes widened briefly, clearly unused to being on the receiving end of such a bold demand. But she quickly composed herself, folding her arms once more and nodding in reluctant agreement. Very well, she replied. Ask, but I make no promises on how much I'll share. Eric's smile grew, satisfaction glimmering in his gaze. Let's start with something simple, then. His tone was deceptively casual, though there was a palpable intensity beneath the surface. Who are you, and why were you sealed away here? Serena hesitated, her expression tightening slightly. My name is Serena, she said finally, each word measured. I'm, as you can see, a vampire. And as for the reason I was sealed here. Her gaze darkened, shadows passing over her face as if memories were stirring in her mind, and she trailed off, almost lost in thought. Let's just say it's complicated, she finished quietly, her voice tinged with a weary sadness. Explaining it fully would take time. And trust. She unfolded her arms, gesturing toward the passageway. But if you're really that curious, you'll need to take me back to my family's home. Perhaps then you'll get your answers. Eric let out a soft chuckle, his eyes gleaming with intrigue. I did say I'm a man driven by curiosity, among other things, he murmured, his gaze assessing. But curiosity alone isn't quite enough to lead me to the doorstep of an ancient vampire clan. Serena's expression softened, but only slightly, as she eyed Eric with a hint of calculation. Of course, you'll be well rewarded for your efforts, she replied, her voice light, but a shadow of hesitation crossed her face. My father must have been searching for me, endlessly, I imagine. She frowned, then arched an eyebrow. But what makes you so certain I belong to a clan of ancient vampires? Perhaps it's just me and my father. Eric stifled a laugh, his amusement evident as he cast her a sidelong look. Please, don't insult my intelligence, he replied, his tone sharp yet laced with dry humor. Just look around. The resources it would take to create such an elaborate seal, buried this deeply, in such a hidden location, it all points to one thing. He let his gaze wander over the stone walls, glancing at the eerie, silent gargoyles looming from every corner, their stone faces twisted in feral snarls. And it's not just the architecture, either. Only vampires have such a love for gargoyles, he said with a dismissive wave. Personally, I've never seen the appeal. Serena's mouth tightened, and her voice took on a defensive edge. And who's to say it was vampires who sealed me here? Eric chuckled, shaking his head. Let's be honest, this place has the stench of vampire handiwork. He gestured at the stone guardians around them. These grotesque statues, the hidden passages, it's all practically screaming vampire crypt. Considering how ancient it all is, I'd even wager you were sealed here sometime around the end of the Merithic era, or at the very start of the First Era. He looked at her with a raised brow, his tone challenging. That says quite a lot about your family. They must have been influential to wield such power when elites and dragons still roamed Tamriel. A frustrated sigh escaped her, and she muttered under her breath, how long has it even been since I was sealed anyway? Her voice held a trace of something vulnerable, quickly concealed. Eric shrugged nonchalantly. Hard to say the exact number, but given the condition of this crypt and the historical style, 5,000 years at least. Serena's face darkened at the estimation, and she cast her gaze downward, though she quickly masked any flicker of emotion. Let's just forget about that for now, she said, brushing the topic aside with a carefully composed expression. You still haven't told me about your friend here. She gestured at Iran, a hint of distaste in her voice as she glanced at his lifeless form. Eric shrugged, his mouth quirking in a wily grin. I'd love to tell you, truly, he said with feigned regret, but I believe I've answered 2 more of your questions than you've answered of mine. He leaned in just slightly, his tone turning sly. And it's only fair, don't you think, that you should indulge my curiosity a bit more? Serena's eyes narrowed, lips pressing into a tight line as she studied him. Finally, she sighed, unfolding her arms and meeting his gaze with reluctant agreement. So stingy, fine, she replied. Ask what you will. But be careful what you wish to know. Eric's gaze lingered on the object strapped to her back, its intricate wrappings and weight unmistakable. That's an Elder Scroll, he remarked, his tone casual yet probing. Does it have anything to do with the reason you were sealed here? Serena's expression flickered, a mix of wariness and reluctance, but she gave a slight nod. Before she could say more, Eric leaned in, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. But, you can't get into the details, can you? He sighed, as if disappointed, but a faint glint betrayed his growing interest. Still, that tells me more than enough to know something fishy is going on. An Elder Scroll, an ancient vampire, now I'm really intrigued. He hummed thoughtfully, making sure to make himself look conflicted. But as I said, curiosity is not enough for me to quite literal put my neck on the line. His tone shifted, lightening with a playful edge. So, about that reward you mentioned, what might I expect? Serena folded her arms, frowning thoughtfully as she considered his words. My father, he'll want to reward you as generously as he can, believe me, she replied slowly, each word measured. And there's nothing he values more than blood. Her eyes narrowed as she studied him, her expression turning almost calculating. You don't seem nearly as averse to my kind as your friend here. Considering the company you keep, she nodded toward Sir and Heelrith, I doubt you'd have trouble fitting into the clan. Eric barely resisted the urge to grin. This was exactly the direction he'd hoped the conversation would take. Still, he put on a thoughtful expression, rubbing his chin as if in hesitation. A vampire, hey? Not the worst offer, he mused aloud. More power, a few centuries or more to do as I please, could be interesting. He shrugged, adding, then again. I'm not sure it's worth the trouble. Most vampires I've run across were little more than feral beasts lurking in shadows. At that, Serena's brow furrowed, a look of faint disdain crossing her face. You can't compare my clan to those degenerates, she said sharply. Feral vampires are shadows of what they could be, their blood diluted through generations. To be a Folkihar is not to be some lowly creature. We're vampire lords. Her words were proud but tempered with a sense of gravitas. We possess abilities and power beyond any lesser bloodline. Eric raised an eyebrow, as if caught off guard. Vampire lords, you say? So, you're a first-generation vampire then? His expression held a mix of respect and intrigue, his tone carrying a hint of awe. Serena hesitated, her expression turning conflicted as she weighed her answer. Finally, she nodded. Yes, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I am what you'd call a daughter of Cold Harbor. Eric's eyes sparkled with interest. The name wasn't one he'd heard lightly in his studies of the arcane and forbidden. Well, Serena, he said, voice laced with a hint of admiration, you just made this offer a whole lot more intriguing, but... Bond forged in blood number 43. Otter's note, I was hoping the last chapter would get a reaction, and holy shit, it did. I got 10 chapters worth of comments, and people crawling out of the woodwork, people I've never seen before on neither comment or like notifications trying to analyze this shit, saying how the chapter makes it sound like this story was written by AI, and how some think this is just bad writing, while others think it's just me trying to make the story realistic. Some were even flaming Eric for being bad at evil LMAO. Anyway, what do I have to say about all of this? Nothing. Everyone is entitled to their opinion and they have a right to scream it in everyone else's faces. Is Iran dead? Is he alive? Is this some elaborate scheme? Who knows? Just read the fucking story and you'll find out. That's how it is with my stories. I don't like to over-explain everything, and I most certainly don't like to reveal everything before it's time to reveal it. But, yeah. I blame TikTok, or whatever app people use to watch them short 60 SEC vids. The stuff is destroying people's attention spans, making them hungry for instant gratification. Anyway, here's the next chapter, maybe you'll find something about Iran here being dead or alive. Then again, maybe you won't, do enjoy. Serena's frown deepened, her gaze sharp as she studied him. But, what exactly do you mean by that? She asked, suspicion lacing her words. Eric let out a slow sigh, shrugging as if he were stating the obvious. I'd like to have my reward up front. He held her gaze, his tone calm but his eyes gleaming with a daring spark. Serena's eyes widened, and she took a small step back, almost incredulous. You mean, you want me to? That's the gist of it, he replied with a nod. If I'm to walk into the home of an ancient vampire clan, I need some assurance. The Folkihar may think twice about tearing me apart if I'm one of their own. But as a mortal. He shook his head, chuckling. I'd rather not gamble on their goodwill. She folded her arms, her expression a mixture of thoughtfulness and hesitation. You don't understand, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Turning someone isn't just a bite in the dark. My father may be liberal with siring to grow the clan, but it's still an intimate act. Eric's smile widened at her words, an amused glint flashing in his eyes. All the more reason you should be the one to turn me. If my options are being embraced by an ancient, likely grumpy vampire lord or a beautiful woman like you, I think I'd rather the latter. He tilted his head, giving her a look that was half challenge, half charm. For a moment, Serena just stared at him, seemingly caught off guard. Then, to his surprise, she let out a low, genuine laugh. Grumpy, she echoed, as if the word struck a nerve. He does get grumpy, especially when things don't go his way. She sighed, the smile fading as she considered his request. Fine. If that's really what you want, I can't deny it would make things easier. Having you on my side is better than you being some loose thread. My home isn't exactly the warmest, most welcoming place. A flicker of surprise crossed Eric's face, but he hid it quickly, tilting his head as he pulled down his collar to reveal his neck. I take it you're not all sweet on home sweet home, then? He asked, voice laced with curiosity. Serena's eyes narrowed, her gaze lingering on the exposed skin, as if weighing every consequence of what she was about to do. She stepped closer, her face only inches from his as she met his gaze with cool resolve. I wouldn't call it sweet, my father and I don't really get along. She murmured, but it's all I've ever known. That will have to change soon enough. With a graceful tilt of her head, she leaned in, her cold breath brushing against his skin as her fangs extended, glinting in the dim light. Eric's heart raced, though he kept his face impassive, as Serena's lips hovered just above his neck. With a slight hesitation, she whispered, just remember, this isn't something you can take back. And with that final warning, she sank her fangs into his neck. Eric's senses stirred as he emerged from the haze of unconsciousness, letting out a low groan. Blinking against the dim light, he focused on the first figures in his sight, Heelrith and Surtur, standing tall and tense, their bony forms leaning forward protectively, their hollow eyes fixed on Serena with a gleaming hostility. Eric could see the skeletal fingers of Heelrith twitching around his sword's hilt, as if ready to strike at any moment. Serena stood a few feet away, her arms crossed and one brow arched as she observed the scene with thinly veiled amusement. "You're finally awake," she said dryly. "I was starting to get nervous. Your little friends here don't seem to like me very much." Eric chuckled, rolling his neck to dispel the stiffness as he rose to his feet with surprising ease. The lightness, the sheer effortlessness of movement startled him. Every nerve and muscle hummed with a new, powerful energy, something he hadn't expected. He glanced at Heelrith and Surtur, giving Surtur a light pat on the skull, and the two skeletons relaxed almost instantly, their aggressive stance dropping as they regarded Serena without further menace. "They're not intelligent enough to make their own judgments," he remarked with a smirk. "Not too unlike children in that way." Eric's gaze shifted to Jerry, who was busily gnawing on a skull that he had acquired from, gods knew where. The sight made Eric chuckle. "The mutt seems to like you well enough, though." Serena shrugged, though a faint smile tugged at her lips. "We raised hounds in my clan, though ours were, a bit different from the usual kind." She gave Jerry a quick glance. "Not that yours here is anything ordinary." She let her eyes rest on Eric, her expression turning serious as she observed him carefully. "In any case, how are you feeling?" Eric flexed his fingers, clenching and unclenching his hands as if to test his newfound strength. "Stronger. There's a lightness, a power that's different." His voice held a note of surprise as he looked down at his hands, feeling the vigor pulsing beneath his skin. "And," he added, frowning slightly, "thirsty." It wasn't just the physical changes that struck him. There was something more profound, a strangeness to his new state, a feeling of being alive and yet not quite. He glanced at Heelrith and Surtur, sensing a heightened connection to them, an affinity that pulsed through his bond with his undead minions, and he felt a smile tug at his lips. It was as if his control over the dead had grown sharper, more instinctive, his influence over them stronger than ever before. But what pleased Eric most was the increase in his magicar reserves. For so long, his power had been a careful balancing act, bolstered only by the Necromancer's amulet. Now, he could feel his reserves brimming, the sensation invigorating. And yet, as he clenched his hand into a fist, he thought of his plans, the limitations and intricacies of this new power. Though he didn't intend to remain a vampire forever, he couldn't deny that it was a convenient state for his current predicament. The broken state of his soul, normally a burden, now offered an unexpected benefit. Ironically, it was this very damage that allowed him to walk the line, transforming into a vampire without fear of Malag Bal's meddling. The fractured state of his soul granted him a certain liberty, evading the notice of the Lord of Domination through a certain precautions that hid what little magicka he had and made it seem even less significant. Serena watched him intently, perhaps sensing the depth of his thoughts, and her gaze softened. "You're taking this all remarkably well," she noted, a hint of admiration in her tone. "Most would be struggling, even resisting the hunger, but you seem almost composed." Eric gave her a grin, the glint of his fangs flashing briefly. "Let's just say I have a strong will." Serena's gaze lingered on Eric for a moment, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of curiosity and appraisal. "It's certainly stronger than most," she remarked, her voice laced with an approving edge. She shifted her focus to the bridge ahead, leading deeper into the crypt's shadowed depths. "But we've wasted enough time here. Let's keep moving. The sooner we're out of here, the better." With an unspoken agreement, they began their trek across the stone bridge. The eerie quiet of the crypt was only broken by the occasional drip of water echoing off distant walls. Along the way, they encountered familiar horrors, skeletal soldiers, Dragra warriors, and even some of the restless souls Eric had fought alongside Iran and Phalion. This time, however, there was an added threat, several towering gargoyles that sprung to life from their stone perches, fangs bared and claws extended. But each ambush was dealt with swiftly by Surtur and Heelrith, whose swift, brutal attacks dispatched everything in their path. Stone claws shattered, and ancient armor crumpled beneath the unyielding force of Eric's summoned guardians. Serena watched the carnage unfold with raised brows, marveling that she didn't even have to lift a finger. As they moved through the crypt, Eric struck up casual conversation with Serena, weaving both truths and carefully crafted lies into his tale. When the subject of Iran inevitably came up, Eric didn't shy away this time. "Iran," he explained, glancing over at her as they stepped past a crumbling pillar, "was actually a vigilant of Stendar. He's here investigating recent vampire activity in Jalmarch." Serena's face remained impassive, but her silence prompted him to continue. "As for myself," he went on smoothly, "I'm more of an independent scholar. My field of study is, let's say it's necromancy and souls, more or less." The faint smirk that crossed Serena's face told him she wasn't entirely convinced by his tale, yet she allowed it without pressing, and that was fine by him. Soon enough, they dispatched the last of the drag regarding the crypt's exit. Among them was a towering warrior, hulking and heavily armored, who had clearly been laid to rest as the champion of this forgotten tomb. His dark, hollowed eyes gleamed with a malice undulled by time, and his movements were fiercer than the others. But with Surtur and Heelrith at his side, Eric took down the champion after a fierce clash. As the dust settled, Eric's eyes were drawn to the far wall, where an ancient word wall loomed. The carved dragon language caught his attention, and he found himself stepping toward it in a trance-like daze, his fingers grazing the ancient script as if feeling the power locked within each etched word. The voice broke his reverie as Serena's voice cut through the silence. That's dragon language, isn't it? Her tone was a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Are you familiar with it? Eric nodded, his fingers tracing a particular word before he stepped back, studying the wall. If you're curious, it reads, here lies the body of Sphilo, who possessed strength to kill a dragon but not the stamina to kill many. He chuckled softly, glancing back at Serena. Sphilo was the hulking dragger, by the way. The one who almost took Surdra's head. Serena fixed Eric with a knowing, slightly skeptical look, her eyes narrowing. And yet, you claimed this place was built by vampires. You're full of it. Eric let out a low chuckle, undeterred by her tone. The section you were sealed in, most certainly, he replied, meeting her gaze with a sly smile. But the crypt as a whole? No, that's classic Nord craftsmanship. This was built as a resting place for Sphilo, to honor his memory. He gestured at the surrounding stone carvings, the intricate architecture that was so distinctly Nordic, from the towering pillars to the solemn engravings. Serena's gaze flickered to the word wall again, and she tilted her head thoughtfully. Ancient Nords certainly had a strange way of honoring someone by also mocking his lack of stamina, she murmured, looking at the inscription with faint amusement. Eric shrugged. It's all about the intent, he replied, glancing back at the wall. The words here aren't meant as an insult. There's a fondness to them, a playfulness, almost like a jest shared between friends. His expression softened a little as he continued. Sphilo was undoubtedly enshrined here by a close confidant who wanted to capture his spirit as much as his strength. He reached out and brushed his fingers across the wall, feeling the ancient power thrumming beneath the stone. If it were meant as mockery, they wouldn't have mentioned his achievement of slaying a dragon. That was the highest honor for a Nord in those times, facing a dragon in battle and living to tell the tale, even if he couldn't slay another. Serena watched him closely, her expression softening as if seeing something more in Eric than she had initially thought. Well, she said finally, her tone shifting back to its usual dryness, it's a good thing Dragra lose most of their strength while they slumber. Otherwise, we'd have been in more trouble than we bargained for. Time dulls even the sharpest of blades, Eric agreed with a nod, a glint of understanding in his eyes. But I think I've indulged my curiosity enough for now. He straightened, brushing off the dust that had settled on his hands, the slightest smile tugging at his lips. Let's keep moving. The sooner we're out of this tomb, the better. They began down the darkened corridor once more, the soft clinking of bones and whisper of Serena's robes filling the silence. He stole a glance at her as they walked. They say the journey is more important than the destination, let loose, try to enjoy the trip. She raised a brow, giving him a sidelong look. Don't flatter yourself. I'm only here because I have no choice. But... She trailed off, the slightest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Let's just say, for now, you're tolerable. Eric chuckled. That's the highest compliment I've received all day, right? Where did you say your family home was? As the sun sank below the horizon, the light softened into a burnished glow, casting long shadows across the camp. Serena sat close to the crackling fire, absently rubbing Jerry's belly as he sprawled contentedly on his back. Her mind drifted back to the last 2 days, a whirlwind of rugged landscapes and tense moments, their escape from Dimalo Crypt leading them through the wild, untamed terrain of Skyrim. After emerging from the crypt, they had taken a much-needed pause to rest, both silently pondering the journey that lay ahead. She knew the path back to Castle Folkihar was no easy one. The crypt had deposited them on the eastern side of the mountain in the heart of the Pale's frost-bitten cliffs. Meanwhile, Castle Folkihar was far to the northwest, just off the shores of Solitude, Skyrim's northern capital. They had crossed the jagged, frozen peaks of the Pale, through the marshes of Jalmarch, and now found themselves on the cusp of Hafingar's territory. Only a few hours separated them from Dragon's Bridge, a sign that they were close to Solitude and, in turn, her family's ancestral home. Serena's gaze shifted to Eric as she added a few more logs to the fire. His newfound strength as a vampire had unnerved her, and while he had repeatedly assured her he was in control, the hunger of a newly sired vampire was notoriously insistent. Eric did not seem like one to overestimate himself, and his self-discipline was unusual in someone new to their bloodlust. But she had insisted no, pestered him to feed, unwilling to risk any unexpected bouts of hunger. And finally, more out of a desire to quiet her than anything else, he had relented. The memory of their stop at the bandit hideout returned to her, vivid as if she were still standing in the shadow of those towering trees, the moon watching over like a silent witness. Eric had moved through the den like a shadow, a blur of strength and precision. She had watched with fascination and a measure of surprise as he dispatched the bandits, not with his prized swordstaff that he seemed to cherish, spells, or his undead, but with the raw physical prowess granted by his vampiric nature. The silver glint of his claws was all he seemed to need. One by one, the bandits fell, unable to stand against his newfound speed and strength. Not once did he draw his blade while dealing with the bandits, and yet there he was, beneath an old oak, performing what she could only interpret as a sword dance under the moonlight. Serena lingered on the edge of the clearing, her gaze fixed on Eric as he moved in a graceful rhythm, his steps and fluid motions reflecting an almost spiritual reverence. The moonlight glinted off his sword staff, casting long shadows across his form as he moved in an intricate, measured pattern, each motion deliberate yet possessing an effortless grace. She didn't interrupt him, fascinated by his poise and the strength that emanated from his movements. When he finally finished, the silence hung between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of the night breeze. She hesitated a moment, then asked, "That swordsmanship, where did you learn it?" She frowned thoughtfully before adding, "My father has also studied the art of the blade. He uses techniques passed down since ancient times, refined almost to perfection. But yours, it's no less impressive." Eric smiled, the hint of a distant memory in his eyes. "Beyond the Sea of Pearls," he began, his voice soft with reminiscence, "peerless sword masters were as common as grains of sand." His gaze drifted to the heavens, as though he were looking across those seas once again. Even the grandest victories felt almost commonplace. In a land of heroes, how can anyone claim to be exceptional? Serena instantly caught on to what he was saying. Her eyes widened with curiosity. "You're a sword singer?" Eric shrugged, a modest gesture at odds with the depth of his skill. "Something like that." She tilted her head, taking in his poetic words with a hint of admiration. "It's strange. You're a necromancer, a swordsman, and now a poet too." He chuckled, the sound warm in the quiet of the night. "A skald, actually," he corrected her, his eyes gleaming. "But those words aren't mine. They belong to Rada al-Saran." Serena's brow furrowed as she searched her memory, the name tugging at the edges of her recollection. "Rada al-Saran. I've heard that name before. The Ashen Lord." Eric nodded, respect evident in his expression. "One and the same. He was among the first Yakutans to set foot in Hammerfell, a sword saint renowned for his mastery of the blade. Some said his skill was so peerless that he could match the gods themselves. It's only natural for you to hear or read about him somewhere even in ancient times, but I bet you didn't know he was a vampire lord." "Another legend," she mused, but her tone was tinged with fascination. "I've heard whispers of his name, even before I was sealed. But to think he, too, was a vampire." Eric's gaze sharpened. Indeed. Rada al-Saran joined the Grey Host in the First Era. But his way of life earned him many enemies, not least among them Malag Bal himself. He paused, a hint of wistfulness coloring his tone. Still, his achievements were so remarkable, they're immortalized in Hermias Mora's infinite archive and apocrypha. His legend has endured through the centuries. Serena shook her head in wonder, a small, wry smile tugging at her lips. "A vampire lord remembered as a hero? I thought I'd heard everything." Eric chuckled, leaning his sword staff against a nearby tree and crossing his arms as he met her gaze. "Not exactly a hero," he corrected gently. "But greatness is not always about heroism. Sometimes it's simply about leaving a mark that refuses to be erased." She nodded thoughtfully, casting her eyes to the shadowed wilderness around them. "To think the world has changed so much. I wonder what else I've missed these past 5,000 years." Her voice was soft, almost wistful, carrying a trace of longing she rarely allowed to show. Eric grinned, his eyes glinting with humor and knowledge. "I can't claim to know everything that's happened, but I do know more than most," he replied, his tone warm and inviting. "If there's anything you want to know." Butterflies number 44. Iran woke with a sudden, desperate gasp, his hand flying to his throat. His fingers searched for a gash, expecting the telltale slickness of blood, the ragged edge of a fatal wound, anything to confirm the horror he remembered. But there was nothing. No wetness, no sting of torn flesh, not even the faintest scar. His skin was whole and untouched. Breathing heavily, he sat up, scanning his surroundings. The crypt loomed around him, dark and cold, the oppressive silence settling back like a shroud. His mind reeled, replaying the memory of Eric's blade slicing across his throat with a precision that left him speechless, helpless as his own blood spilled over his hands, suffocating him. The burn of the wound, the choke of blood, he remembered every agonizing detail. His fingers twitched involuntarily, the phantom pain still fresh in his nerves. And yet, if not for the dried blood staining his clothes and pooling on the stone floor, he would have thought it nothing but a bad dream. "What an oblivion!" he muttered, rubbing his neck as if he might finally feel the scar he knew should be there. His hand stilled as a memory surfaced, the strange potion Eric had given him before their journey, a bitter concoction Eric had claimed would keep him warm in the frigid crypt. Had it saved him somehow? Could it have been more than just a cold remedy? He shook his head, his thoughts tangling in frustration. There was no sense to be found here. The only certainty he felt was a slow burning rage. God's damned bastard! He muttered under his breath, his voice thick with bitterness. Still distracted, he absent-mindedly reached into his armor and pulled out a vial labeled Cure Disease. There was no sign of any vampire bite on his body, but he wasn't about to risk turning into one of those cursed blood drinkers. He studied the crimson liquid within, the thick substance swirling sluggishly in the glass, then sighed, uncorking the bottle. Just as he lifted it to his lips, he paused. The red liquid inside had shifted, revealing words written along the glass, their ink the same rich hue as the potion itself. Formerly hidden beneath the liquid, the words now gleamed in the dim light, a single mocking phrase. To trick your enemies, you must first trick your allies. Iron's face went blank, his mind racing, the words burning into him like an insult. Slowly, comprehension dawned, the weight of realization twisting into raw fury. The potion. Eric had given it to him. Another ploy, another damned lie. Bastard! He shouted, hurling the bottle to the ground with all his strength. It shattered against the stone, shards scattering like glittering fragments, the liquid seeping into the cracks and pooling in crimson patches. Iron's deductions were sound, yet he could never have fathomed the depth of Eric's preparation. The potion he had been made to drink was no simple brew, it was a rare concoction, one crafted long ago to simulate death, a lifeline the old Necromancer himself had once relied on when he was cornered and besieged. It was a tool as precise as it was ruthless and precious. The Cure Disease potion that he had thrown to the ground was far from ordinary. Unlike the stasis potion, where the liquid itself was the life-saving element, this vial's true value lay in the bottle itself. Magically enchanted, it anchored his soul to his body, preserving him just long enough for the stasis effect of fate and life to seep back in. Had he known all this, Iron might have felt something other than this raw, choking fury. But he didn't know, and, perhaps, he never would. The silence in the crypt thickened once more, swallowing the sound of shattering glass and the echoes of his curses. The air was stale, heavy with the lingering weight of his outburst, bitter and unyielding. His hands trembled as he stood alone, his anger like a smoldering ember in his chest. It was as though he had awoken from one nightmare, only to realize he was now ensnared in another, a carefully laid trap that held him fast, its true purpose still veiled in the shadows. The soft light of dawn barely pierced the thick mist cloaking Morthal, casting an eerie glow over the still and silent town. Within Jarl Idrod Ravencrone's dimly lit chamber, Falion approached the throne with a steady, calm stride, his dark robes trailing along the stone floor as he prepared to deliver his report. Jarl Idrod sat there, her expression distant, her eyes as deep and unfathomable as the marshes surrounding her hold. She looked up as Falion arrived, her lips tightening slightly as though she sensed his news before he even spoke. The vampires that plagued Morthal, he began, his voice measured, they have disappeared. Not a trace remains. Idrod's gaze sharpened, her hand tapping lightly on the worn armrest. And what of the daughter of Cold Harbor? She asked, her tone both curious and cautious, laced with the faintest thread of concern. Falion hesitated, casting a thoughtful glance to the floor before answering. I can't say for certain. But if the vampires are retreating, it would seem Eric's plan succeeded. Serena must be far from Morthal by now. The Jarl nodded slowly, her eyes distant once again. Out of sight, out of mind, she murmured, almost to herself. Her voice dropped to a low, weary tone. Let the vampires become someone else's problem. We have enough of our own. For a moment, her gaze drifted out to the misty town through the stone window slit, her face betraying a rare glimpse of exhaustion. Then she looked back at Falion, her expression softening. If only the people of Morthal knew how much you've given to them. Falion allowed himself a small, almost self-deprecating smile. Let them stew in their blissful ignorance, Jarl. Wisdom can be a heavy burden, and I acted out of respect for you, and to keep my young apprentice safe. Idrod's expression softened further at the mention of Agni. And how is Agni these days? At the question, Falion's smile widened, pride evident in his voice. As bright as ever. With time, she'll be a mage of great renown, if not more. His eyes lit up, and he added, almost to himself, she's already learning faster than I had anticipated. A faint sigh escaped Idrod, and she leaned back in her chair, her weathered face growing contemplative. I certainly hope the divines grant me enough time to see that future. At her words, Falion's expression grew serious, and he hesitated a moment before speaking. The divines. He began cautiously. Have they revealed any visions to you of late? Her lips curved in a knowing smile, her gaze turning wry. The divines show me many things, Falion. None that you would be particularly curious about as of late. She paused, amusement flickering in her eyes before she added, they don't seem inclined to meddle with that man any more than they already have. But it is not for me to interpret their will. Falion looked down, thoughtful, her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He could sense the weight of things yet to come, the rippling changes that seemed to echo through Tamriel. And it seemed Idrod, too, could feel that weight. Her gaze drifted again toward the mist, her face shadowed. Still, even without the divine's whispers, I can sense the world shifting, Fallion. Whether it will change for better or worse. I fear even they might not know. The silence that followed held a quiet, unspoken understanding. In that small, secluded room, beneath the cold stone and amidst the veil of dawn, both Fallion and Idrod felt the invisible tension that settled over Morthal and, perhaps, over all of Skyrim, a sense that they stood on the cusp of something greater and far darker than they had yet faced. The candle light flickered across the opulent yet shadowy walls of Maven Blackbriar's office, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to move in step with her calculating gaze. Brynjolf entered quietly, his steps cautious as he took in the woman seated behind the desk, her sharp eyes fixed intently on him, every inch of her posture emanating control. Brynjolf, Maven greeted, her tone curt. I trust you know why I summoned you. Brynjolf gave a small nod, forcing himself to hold her gaze, though her scrutiny was far from comfortable. I had a feeling. Her lips twisted into a half-smile, though there was no warmth behind it. You've been poking around Riften and beyond, I hear. Disappearing for hours, sometimes days, with no word. I can't help but wonder what's so important that it keeps you out of sight and earshot. He hesitated for a moment, weighing his next words carefully, but he knew she wouldn't appreciate a delay. I've been looking into a possibility, Maven. It's about the Thieves' Guild. About the bad luck we've been dealing with. I have reason to believe it might be a curse. A curse? Maven scoffed, her tone dripping with disdain. She leaned back in her chair, waving off the notion. Don't tell me you're starting to believe in ghost stories now, Brynjolf. You've had some setbacks, that's all. Get back to business, keep your head down, and we'll be back on our feet. Brynjolf's jaw tightened. He'd expected this reaction, but it still grated on him. I thought the same, Maven. Until I spoke with Thane Eric. Her expression stilled at the mention of Eric, her eyes narrowing slightly as her interest grew. Eric. She repeated, her tone softer, more controlled. What exactly did he tell you? Brynjolf exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't come out and say it directly. But he hinted that the trouble we're in might have something to do with Nocturnal herself. That it might even be related to the disappearance of the old guild master. Maven's expression darkened, the calculating glint in her eyes growing sharper. So Eric believes Nocturnal is the one responsible for this curse. And you're implying Mercer Frey might have something to do with it. Brynjolf hesitated, searching for the right words, though it felt as if every one carried a heavier weight than the last. Eric didn't outright accuse Mercer. But he pointed me in his direction, Maven. Made it seem like Mercer might have done something to anger Nocturnal herself. I don't know what, exactly, but if there's truth to it. Maven's hand clenched on the armrest of her chair, her face a mask of unreadable coldness. Mercer Frey is a business partner, she replied icily, her voice even and dangerously calm. Our arrangement has been profitable and mutually beneficial for a long time. What exactly do you intend to do if he's indeed crossed Nocturnal? Brynjolf looked away, conflicted, but he couldn't deny the resolve slowly building within him. I don't know yet. But if the curse is real, if it keeps draining the guild the way it has, then soon enough, we'll be nothing but a hollow remnant of what we once were. And that would make things difficult, even for you. A tense silence settled between them, and for a long moment, Brynjolf wondered if he'd finally pushed too far. But Maven's gaze remained level, her fingers tapping thoughtfully against the desk. Continue your investigation, she said at last, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, though the command in it was unmistakable. But report to me first before you make any foolish moves. Understood. Brynjolf nodded, his shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. Understood. The silence resumed, but now it felt charged with something darker and heavier. Brynjolf turned to leave, feeling her gaze follow him out of the room, like a shadow in the candlelight. As he reached the door, her voice stopped him. And Brynjolf, she called softly, yet with an edge that reminded him just how much was at stake. Whatever you find, remember whose interests your actions might affect. He gave a final nod, pushing down the growing knot of apprehension in his gut as he left Maven's chambers, her words echoing ominously in his mind. Outside the imposing, snow-covered gates of Windhelm, Newrlian stood bundled in thick furs, leaning heavily on his staff. The air was biting cold, but his gaze was aflame with a fervor that cut through the chill. Around him, the mercenaries he'd hired shifted impatiently, casting wary glances his way. Some of them looked skeptical, others resigned. Clearly, escorting an elderly alchemist into the depths of a ruin was not their typical fare. Quintus Navel hurried toward him, clutching his own cloak close to his chest, his breath visible in the cold air as he rushed to keep up. His face was creased with worry, and his eyes darted between his master and the hired swords surrounding them. Master, he began, his tone pleading. Are you truly certain you must go yourself? You're no longer as spry as you used to be. These mercenaries can handle the retrieval without risking your health. Let them earn their pay. Neuralian's weathered face turned toward Quintus, his gaze sharp, defiant. Quintus, I am not entrusting my life's work to these brutes, he scoffed, sparing a dismissive glance toward the mercenaries. Do you think they'll understand the value of the white phial? One careless touch, one misstep, and it could be shattered before it even sees the light of day again. No, I must be there to ensure its safety. Quintus's brows knit in frustration, though he masked it with concern. I understand, but if something goes wrong, if you are injured or worse, who will carry on your work? Who will guide me? Neuralian waved a dismissive hand. Bah! My health is inconsequential compared to the phial. Don't you see, Quintus? This isn't just some trinket. This is an artifact holds untold alchemical knowledge, lost to time and mystery. I have spent decades dreaming of this day, and I refuse to let it slip away. My hands will be the first to hold it mine. Quintus took a steadying breath. And what if the journey itself claims you, master? It's a grueling trek through dangerous terrain. Let the mercenaries handle it, they're trained for this. Do you think I fear a little rough travel at my age? Neuralian's voice cracked with both anger and something softer desperation. I'm an old man, Quintus. Every day, every breath I take could be my last. If I wait any longer, I may never see the phial at all. I cannot risk that. This is my purpose, Quintus. My last chance to finish what I started all those years ago. Quintus swallowed, glancing down before speaking softly, if that's how you feel, I won't try to stop you. But at least let me come along. If something happens, I'll be there to help you. Neuralian considered his apprentice, his face softening for a brief moment. You are a good apprentice, Quintus. Loyal. But you're needed here. If I should not return, you are the one who will carry on what I've built. Someone has to look after the shop, after the ingredients, after my life's knowledge. That is your duty. Quintus sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. Very well. I can see there's no changing your mind. He lowered his voice, glancing at the mercenaries before looking back to Neuralian. But be careful. The phial isn't worth your life. Neuralian smiled, though it was a wan, tired thing. Don't be so dramatic, Quintus. I'll return with the phial, and all will be well. You'll see. The two shared a look, a lingering moment of unspoken words and worry. Finally, Neuralian gave Quintus a reassuring pat on the shoulder, nodding toward the waiting mercenaries. Let's go, then. He commanded, his voice crackling with an energy that defied his age. Chance meeting number 45. Eric studied his reflection in the cracked mirror of the small, dimly lit room in Dragon Bridge's Inn, his expression as dark as the shadows under his eyes. He muttered, almost to himself, I look like I kick puppies for sport. His pale skin, unnaturally sallow and grey from the botched soul transfer that had scarred his very essence, stood out even more after his transformation into a vampire. And those eyes glowing faintly with an eerie blue radiance looked back at him, as though they belonged to a man no longer entirely tethered to the mortal realm. Every glance in a reflective surface reminded him of what he'd lost and, perhaps, what he wanted to become. It took a regular application of illusion magic just to dull the glow, to keep from drawing every stare in the inn. Serena leaned against the wall, watching him with a smirk. It's a wonder the common folk don't stone you on sight, she mocked, picking up Jerry, who lay curled by the fire, and lifting the small corgi to eye level. Then again, I bet it's thanks to Jerry here he's probably the only thing balancing out that unsettling look of yours. Eric turned to her, half offended, half amused, and raised an eyebrow. Not to brag, but this face of mine is considered quite good looking these days. Intimidating, sure. But still easy on the eyes. He smoothed back his disheveled hair as if to make his point, the hint of a playful smile tugging at his mouth. Serena rolled her eyes, setting Jerry down. You're so full of it, Eric. She trailed off, letting out a sigh as she glanced around the cramped, drafty room. Honestly, I wish we'd gone to Solitude instead. At least then, we wouldn't be on top of each other in this tiny closet they call a room, and I wouldn't have to listen to you complain about your looks. Absolutely not. Eric's voice held a rare edge of finality. He shook his head, and his gaze hardened as he looked away. I'll take you anywhere else you want. But not Solitude. Never Solitude. Serena's brow furrowed. She hadn't heard him use that tone often, especially not with her. What's wrong with Solitude? She asked, a mix of curiosity and unease in her voice. It's not far from here. In fact, it would have been the most sensible place to stay. He kept his eyes fixed on the wall, hesitating, as though searching for a way to explain without making her suspicious, or worse, curious. Solitude was where Sheogorath, the Daedric Prince of Madness, was known to frequent from time to time, visiting his old pal Pelagius. If the Daedric princes didn't already know of his presence in this world and Boethia already revealed that they do, then he might have visited Solitude, but even then, he would have stayed as far away from the Blue Palace as possible. That's how little he wanted to do with the Mad God, or the Damned Dog, as he likes to be called on occasion. Eric's ego made him confident in bargaining with even the likes of Boethia, and to sip on power right from under the nose of Malag Bal, but Sheogorath was someone Eric wouldn't want to cross even if he were 10 times more arrogant and confident in his abilities. The Daedric Prince of Madness was not only unpredictable, but he was also deceptively cunning, and extremely powerful, traits that made even other Daedric lords wary of him. It's a long story, he finally replied, his voice firm yet distant. A story that's best saved for another time. His eyes softened as he glanced back at her. Just trust me on this. Serena gave him a scrutinizing look, but something in his eyes told her not to press further. With a slight frown, she nodded, letting the silence settle between them. After a moment, she shrugged. Fine. But don't think I'm letting you keep all your mysterious secrets forever. Wouldn't dream of it. He allowed himself a tired smile, though a glint of worry lingered in his gaze. Now, let's get some rest. We'll need it before we head out tomorrow. As the candlelight flickered in their cramped quarters, Eric settled onto the ground while Serena took the bed, his thoughts tangled in the dangers ahead. Eric and Serena navigated down the steep, snow-covered slope, their boots sinking into the powdery drifts that blanketed the rocky path. In the distance, a stone castle jutted out against the pale horizon, perched precariously at the edge of a cliff. The sea glistened under an unusually bright sun, its icy breeze cutting across the land and reaching them even from afar. Serena pulled her hood lower over her face, grimacing as the sunlight hit her skin. It's good to breathe the open air after being cooped up in that stone coffin, she muttered, her voice filled with a rare appreciation for the surroundings. Then, adjusting her hood, she added, but let's hurry, the sun isn't exactly friendly to my skin. You know what I mean. Eric chuckled, shielding his eyes as he glanced up at the bright sky. Despite the cold, the sunlight felt a bit too intense for his liking. I know exactly what you mean, he replied, his tone laced with wry amusement. But as he turned his gaze back to the path, his laughter faded. He stopped, his eyes narrowing at the sight of 3 figures farther down the slope. Dressed in elaborate, gleaming robes that seemed out of place against the snowy backdrop, the figures led a disheveled man with bound hands, his head bowed and movements sluggish as they marched him up the incline. The robed figures moved with an air of cold authority, their golden faces impassive against the harsh light. Their clothes and posture practically shouted their identity, and Eric's face hardened. Serena followed his gaze, her expression souring. Those are elves. And they've got a captive. She shot Eric a skeptical look, folding her arms. I thought you said the Elides were gone. That history had finally buried them. Eric winced, recognizing her suspicion. They are gone, he replied, the bitterness in his voice undeniable. These aren't Elides. These are Altmer Thalmer Justiciars of the Third Aldmeri Dominion. He clenched his jaw, his eyes lingering on the figures with a look of quiet contempt. And in their own way, they're even worse than the Elides ever were. Serena arched an eyebrow, intrigued by the loathing in his tone. Oh? How so? He shook his head, almost as if the question pained him. The Elides were cruel, tyrannical, and they never bothered hiding it. They ruled with iron fists, their intentions as clear as their ruthlessness. He gestured at the elves below, his mouth twisting with distaste. These Thalmer, though, put on airs of civility, as if they're righteous enforcers of law and order. They like to paint themselves as the only hope for the world. But they're no better than anyone else. Serena's eyes narrowed as she studied the group ahead. Hypocrites, then. Exactly, and no one likes a hypocrite. Eric said, his voice low and firm. He glanced back at the path, his expression hardening. Best to ignore them. Nothing good will come from getting involved with the Thalmer. They'll try to twist anything we do into something against us. Serena hesitated, her gaze lingering on the captive. But, they've got someone bound like a prisoner, what's all this about? Eric's hand clenched at his side. Who knows? We're in no position to make an enemy of the Thalmer out here in the open. He started forward again, motioning for her to follow. Let's just stay on our path. We have bigger things to deal with. The Thalmer Justiciars, noticing Eric and Serena as they drew closer, began to exchange whispers, their gold and black robes rustling as they leaned toward each other. One of them squinted in Eric's direction, his eyes sharp and suspicious. Sensing the attention, Jerry growled low in his throat, his blue eyes locked onto the Altmer, bristling with quiet hostility. Eric glanced down at his companion, his own face revealing nothing, as he slipped a hand into his cloak to pull out Roget's mask. The ancient visage covered his features, casting a dark shadow over his face. Serena's eyes flicked over to him, noticing the mask. What are you doing now? She whispered, suspicion tinging her voice. Eric's reply was calm, almost indifferent. Hide your face well. We don't know what these Thalmer might do. He cast a hard look at the figures ahead, each of them bristling with a kind of arrogance only the Thalmor seemed to master. No point in making ourselves easier to recognize if things go sideways. Though slightly puzzled, Serena obeyed, pulling her hood down and lowering her gaze to avoid drawing attention to herself. She sensed his tension, but with her centuries of caution as a vampire, she knew when to follow Eric's lead. Meanwhile, Eric's mind turned to their destination, his eyes narrowing as he looked down the slope toward the fortress silhouetted against the blue horizon. North Watch Keep, he thought grimly. From what he remembered, it was an old fort controlled by the Thalmor, often used as a prison for the unfortunate souls caught in the Dominion's web of justice. He returned his gaze to the small group ahead of them. The bound man, stumbling and trailing slightly behind the justiciars, was clearly no friend of theirs. So, they're escorting a prisoner, but where to, and why? Eric mused, feeling a pang of irritation. I hope we didn't just stumble onto one of their miserable plots. As they closed the distance, Eric's expression hardened beneath the mask. He and Serena passed by the Thalmor without incident, each party cautiously sizing up the other but holding their distance. Eric almost allowed himself a sigh of relief almost. Then, in a voice as cold as the snow-dusted landscape, one of the justiciars called out, "Hey, you!" Eric didn't pause or turn. He let his breath out in a measured sigh, his fingers subtly flexing. Serena stopped, glancing at him expectantly, a silent question in her eyes as if to ask how he intended to handle this. But to her surprise, he didn't answer. Instead, Eric's body shifted with a fluid swiftness as he drew the Wormspire sword staff from his back, the weapon's edge glinting in the midday sun. Eric's ebony greaves dug deep into the snow, his body tense like a drawn bow. Then, with a speed beyond mortal comprehension, he sprang forward, his movements a blur even to Serena. In a whispered chant, he hissed, "You should have mind your damned business." Havok vaulted Ra. And his form seemed to shimmer, vanishing from one spot only to reappear an instant later directly behind the first justiciar. Before anyone could react, the Thalmor's head was sent spinning into the air, the severed neck sending out a crimson spray that stained the white snow beneath. Not pausing, Eric flowed toward his next target, a sharp-edged shard of ice forming in his hand. With a flick of his wrist, he hurled the projectile, and his target instinctively drew his sword, bracing to deflect the incoming spike. But just before the blade connected, the ice shattered mid-air, fragmenting into countless tiny, razor-sharp needles. Each shard pierced through the Altmer's exposed flesh, the sudden agony sending him stumbling backward, his face contorted in shock as blood trickled from dozens of fresh wounds. Eric didn't spare him a glance. He was already on the move, his boots kicking up fresh sprays of snow as he zeroed in on the final justiciar. This one had watched his companions fall and was far more prepared. He raised his hand, summoning flames that coalesced into a burning sphere. With a wordless snarl, the elf hurled the fireball directly at Eric. But Eric was ready. A lesser ward flickered to life in his free hand, and with a sharp crack, he slapped the fiery projectile aside, its flames dispersing harmlessly into the snowy ground. His ward shattered, but Eric's eyes narrowed with an almost amused glint. As expected of an Altmer, he muttered, a slight sneer in his tone. Competent at magic, if little else. The justiciar hissed in fury, his hands weaving more fire and ice, launching spell after spell toward Eric in rapid succession. But Eric sidestepped or parried each attack, pressing forward with an unrelenting ferocity until the elf found himself backing up. Finally, realizing the hopelessness of his magical barrage, the justiciar summoned twin Daedric blades, ethereal and violet, crackling with a dark, foreboding energy. His face contorted with disdain as he spat, "Filthy human." Eric's only response was a cold, unyielding gaze. Raising his blade, he intoned once more, "Havok vaulted Ra." The words left his lips like a command of death itself, and Wormspire's edge took on a shadowy, ethereal aura, elongating with black energy that crackled and hissed. As Eric brought the weapon down in a brutal arc, the Thalmor crossed his blades above his head to block. But Wormspire's empowered edge cleaved through the conjured swords as if they were nothing more than mist, and the momentum carried forward, slicing through the justiciar's helm, armor, and body, splitting him cleanly in half. Both halves fell to the snow with a dull thud, lifeless. Eric exhaled, flicking his blade to the side to scatter the Thalmor's blood across the snow before sheathing it with a decisive click. The crunch of approaching footsteps caught his attention, and he turned to see Serena making her way over, her brow raised and lips pulled into an amused smirk. Meanwhile, Jerry was sniffing the severed head of the first justiciar with a curious excitement, his icy blue eyes gleaming. Serena sighed, shaking her head as she glanced at the blood-strewn slope. "Well, at least you didn't take your time with them." She gave Eric a bemused look. "What happened to ignore the Thalmor and avoid getting entangled with them?" Eric shrugged, a nonchalant glint in his eyes. "Knowing the Thalmor? Entangling with them was inevitable the moment they called out to us." "So you say." She rolled her eyes, "But I have a feeling you wanted to do this the moment you laid eyes on them." He chuckled, the sound dry and almost begrudging. "You're not wrong there. Eric's gaze drifted from her to the prisoner the Thalmor had been leading. Despite his tattered clothes and bound hands, the man stood tall, seemingly unaffected by the biting cold that whipped around them. Broad-shouldered and muscular, his hair was braided and reached his shoulders, while a striking red tattoo fierce and tribal marked the left side of his face. Eric's eyes narrowed slightly, the tattoo sparking a flicker of recognition. "You're of Akaviri descent," Eric observed, genuine surprise threading his voice. The prisoner's own surprise mirrored Eric's, and he straightened slightly, wariness shading his eyes. "What of it?" "Nothing," Eric replied, a faint, intrigued smile forming. "I just didn't expect to find someone like you here. Especially when, well, let's say a certain someone went to great lengths to rid Skyrim of your bloodline long ago." The prisoner's brow furrowed, as if trying to piece together Eric's cryptic words, but he held his tongue. He didn't press for more, though the curiosity was evident in his gaze. Eric's mind drifted to the memories he bore of the old necromancer whose essence still lingered within him. The Akaviri invasion had been an unexpected hindrance, arriving at a pivotal moment and disrupting some of Eric's predecessors' carefully laid plans. The necromancer had lashed out in fury, crippling many of their fleets. His actions were one of the many reasons Skyrim hadn't fallen to Akavir at the time. However, it had been a campaign of personal vengeance, one born of disruption rather than anything else. Shaking off the old memories. "What's your name?" The prisoner hesitated but answered with a steady voice, "Caden." Eric's eyes flicked over him with renewed curiosity. "Why were you imprisoned by the Thalmor, then?" Caden exhaled, his shoulders loosening slightly as he replied, "Because of my weapon. I was trained with a katana as my ancestors were, and apparently that's all it takes for the Thalmor to jump to conclusions. They thought I was a blade. That symbol, it stirs the Thalmor's fury like nothing else." A moment passed before Eric burst into laughter, the sound echoing across the snow-dusted slope. "So you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time?" he asked, his laughter mingling with the frosty air. "And here I thought my luck was cursed." Caden allowed himself a wry smile. "I'm glad my misfortune amuses you at the very least." Eric's laughter faded into a chuckle, and he looked back at Serena. She was watching them both with a faint smile of her own, her arms crossed and amusement bright in her eyes. "Well," Eric said, turning back to Caden, "I believe it's fate we met here. Caden, how would you like to shed some Thalmor blood with me?" Jerry, the connoisseur number 46. Now draped in a worn cloak that covered his tattered rags and hid his face in shadow, Caden stood at the edge of the pathway, watching as Eric strolled purposefully toward the entrance of Northwatch Keep. The fortress loomed ahead, its imposing stone walls blanketed in frost, while the cold sea air whistled through cracks in the stone. The entrance, a stone archway without so much as a wooden gate to bar passage, was guarded by 2 Thalmor soldiers, their rigid postures and gleaming golden armor unmistakably Altmer. Caden suppressed a sigh, his eyes narrowing as Eric approached the guards with the confidence of a man on a leisurely walk rather than an infiltration. He had reluctantly agreed to go along with Eric's wild plan not only because the Thalmor had stolen his armor and weapons, but because they had spent days torturing him within the very walls of this keep. But as Eric closed the distance, Caden realized that Eric's plan was, well, less a plan and more an idea. He didn't intend to sneak or bluff his way through, no, Eric was simply going to walk in. Whatever, Caden thought, resigned, releasing an internal sigh. It's too late to back out now. The Thalmor soldiers exchanged a glance as Eric approached, and one of them, a tall Altmer with a contemptuous glare, stepped forward, meeting Eric halfway. His expression twisted as he took in Rogat's unsettling mask. "Remove your mask and identify yourself immediately," the soldier demanded, his voice cold and imperious. Without breaking his stride, Eric replied in an even, almost serene tone, "I'm here on official business. I have something to deliver." Caden's eyebrows lifted as he watched the exchange, a spark of morbid curiosity taking hold. The soldier's confusion was mirrored on Caden's face, but the guard's skepticism outweighed his caution as he sneered. "Well? Get on with it." A subtle smile played beneath Eric's mask. He reached into his cloak, his movements deliberate, and pulled out a dark, oval object. With a fluid, almost casual flick of his wrist, he tossed it toward the soldier. Instinctively, the guard raised his hands, catching the object in midair, but his smirk faltered almost instantly. He froze, his fingers sinking into something warm and disturbingly wet. His brow furrowed as he lowered his gaze, eyes widening in horror as he registered the ghastly details: a severed Altmer head, blood still dripping from the neck, the mouth slack, and lifeless golden eyes fixed in eternal terror. Caden winced, a shiver crawling up his spine as he muttered under his breath, "So that's why he took the head." The Thalmor guard's face turned deathly pale, his composure unraveling as the reality set in. What is this?" he stammered, the color draining from his cheeks as he stumbled backward, dropping the head as if it had burned him. Before anyone could fully grasp the horror of the severed head rolling in the snow, Eric moved with lethal precision. His form blurred in the cold air, and in an instant, he was standing before the paralyzed Thalmor soldier, his iron grip latching onto the elf's face. The soldier gasped, his fear-stricken eyes meeting the calm, detached gaze of Eric. "Nothing much," Eric murmured, voice cold and even, "I just thought you should see the face of the one who brought about your death before you joined him." With a grim finality, he tightened his hold, his fingers digging into the elf's skull with a force that shattered bone and tore flesh. There was a sickening pop as the soldier's head imploded, a splatter of blood painting the snow and the fortress wall in deep crimson. The elf's lifeless body slumped to the ground, leaving Eric standing alone in the thickening silence. Caden could only stare, shock settling in his chest like a stone. But the moment of stillness was fleeting. The remaining guard at the gate regained his senses, his sword rasping as he drew it from its sheath. His face twisted with both fury and horror as he fixed his gaze on Eric, who merely raised an eyebrow, unfazed. Before Caden could react, a low growl sounded beside him, and Jerry, Eric's odd, stubby-legged mutt, launched himself at the guard with surprising ferocity. The small dog soared through the air with surprising strength and accuracy, his fangs sinking directly into the Altmer's exposed neck. A guttural yelp escaped the guard as Jerry latched on, tearing at the elf's throat with vicious, unrelenting bites. Blood sprayed across the snow in brutal arcs, chunks of flesh landing in a grotesque spatter. Caden's jaw dropped, his hand frozen on the sword hilt as he watched the unlikely scene unfold. Just when he thought he'd seen enough, Serena strode forward through the carnage, her calm expression unruffled as she knelt to scoop up Jerry. The tiny dog wagged his tail in her arms, licking his bloody muzzle as if he hadn't just ripped an elf's throat out. Caden gaped, trying to wrap his mind around the bizarre contrast of Jerry's brutal ferocity and Serena's nonchalant handling. Eric's amused chuckle snapped him out of his shock, and Caden looked up to see Eric watching him with a wry grin. "I didn't bring you here to be a spectator, boy," Eric said, his voice edged with dry humor. "I gave you that sword for a reason, so take it out and do something." "Anything?" Caden blinked, caught off guard by Eric's casual tone. He took a deep breath, fingers finally closing around the weapon's hilt as he nodded. He was no stranger to combat, but the intensity of Eric's methods, and the sheer disregard for finesse, was something new. Eric didn't wait for a response. Without a word, he turned and walked through the archway into the fortress yard, his steps deliberate and unheard despite the shouts of alarm now ringing through the keep. Inside, Thalmer's soldiers shouted orders, some brandishing weapons while others cast wary glances at Eric's advancing form. Cries of "intruders at the gate!" echoed around the stone walls as soldiers rushed into formation. But Eric remained unfazed, his eyes narrowing with a predatory gleam. He assessed the Thalmer soldiers gathering in the yard, and with a dangerous calm, he spoke over his shoulder to Caden, "These are the people who've been torturing you for days, go wild and don't worry about a thing." Caden's frown deepened as he glanced up at the Thalmer archers lining the battlements above, their sharp eyes trained on him and his companions, bows drawn taut with lethal intent. The archers moved with well-practiced precision, arrows nocked and ready to rain down from above. "Don't worry about a thing," Caden muttered, wincing as he eyed the archers' drawn bows. "That's easier said than done. They're not wood elves, but their bows are just as deadly." Eric chuckled, his tone light despite the looming threat. He turned to Serena with a mischievous grin beneath his mask. "Would you kindly?" Serena sighed, rolling her eyes in exaggerated exasperation. "And here I thought you were supposed to be escorting me, not the other way around." Despite her words, she stepped forward without further protest, placing Jerry on the ground with a gentle pat on the head before shifting her focus to the archers above. Eric's eyes glinted with a blue glow beneath his mask, watching the surge of magicka gathering in Serena's body as she channeled her spell. A droplet of blood welled from beneath Serena's fingernail, lifting delicately into the air. It hovered for a heartbeat before gliding forward, expanding and twisting with potent magicka. Eric watched in fascination as the droplet transformed mid-air, blooming outward into a transparent red wall that solidified just as the Thalmer archers released their volley of arrows. The incoming projectiles struck the blood barrier with dull thuds, each arrow ricocheting off its surface to clatter uselessly on the ground below. Eric raised an eyebrow, genuinely impressed. "Hemamancy, hey!" he murmured to himself, a slight grin forming under the mask. "I never bothered with it beyond theory since I lacked a certain talent, but now." He raised his hand, magicka swirling and crackling at his fingertips as he focused on the blood seeping from the bodies of the two dead Thalmer guards. With a low, rumbling incantation, the blood lifted from the fallen elves, coalescing into a floating sphere above his open palm, dark red and pulsing with raw energy. With a quick jolt of his wrist, Eric pushed a surge of his own magicka into the sphere, which began to churn and swell with violent intensity. It hovered ominously, a dark orb of blood and power, before splitting into two smaller spheres. Eric sent a wicked smile Caden's way, and with a subtle flick of his fingers, the blood orbs shot forward, speeding toward either side of the battlements where the archers clustered. The two orbs shot forward, gliding through the cold air until they hovered just above the Thalmer archers positioned on the battlements. As they drifted closer, their ominous effect became immediately apparent. Dark tendrils of blood began to snake out from the eyes, ears, and mouths of the archers within range, drawn inexorably toward the orbs as if by some dark gravitational pull. The soldiers, helpless to resist, convulsed as their very lifeblood was siphoned away, the once small orbs swelling and pulsing with every additional drop of blood absorbed. Some of the archers, gripped with terror, tried to fight back, letting arrows fly at the menacing spheres. Yet each arrow simply passed through the orbs as though they were mist, leaving not a scratch on the dark, writhing masses. The orbs continued their harvest, swelling larger and darker until all that remained of the Thalmor archers were shriveled husks, bodies twisted and dry, their skin taut over bones like the remains of some ancient mummified corpse. Then, with the chilling silence, the orbs paused, shimmering with a sinister glow, before shooting downward. They merged midair, forming a massive sphere of blood that loomed above the elven mages who had gathered below, each of them raising their hands in desperate attempts to cast protective spells. But before a single shield could manifest, the orb burst, exploding in a furious shower of blood spikes that rained down like scarlet javelins. The spears tore through the mages' ranks, punching through their robes, piercing hearts, throats, and spines with ruthless efficiency. The mages fell where they stood, the ground around them now painted a gruesome red. Eric turned to Caden with an almost casual air, gesturing toward the remaining 5 Thalmor soldiers, who stood paralyzed with horror and disbelief at the massacre before them. You should be able to handle those 5, no? Caden nodded grimly, his grip tightening on the hilt of the sword Eric had given him. He didn't need any further instruction, with a steely look in his eye, he charged forward, his boots crunching against the snow as he closed the distance. The Thalmor soldiers raised their swords in a desperate attempt to defend themselves, but Caden moved with brutal efficiency. His blade cut through them one by one, each swing precise and decisive, leaving no room for mercy. As Caden dispatched the last of the Thalmor, Serena dropped the blood barrier she'd maintained, the shimmering red wall fading into nothingness. She stepped up beside Eric, arms crossed as she looked him over with a wry smile. Not bad, she admitted, cocking an eyebrow. But you didn't need to use quite that much blood for the spell, a bit excessive, don't you think? Her smirk grew, a challenging gleam in her eyes. You still have a lot to learn. Eric rolled his eyes beneath his mask, but there was a hint of respect in his tone. As I am now, it's impossible for me to match you in blood magic, he said, his voice straightforward. It wasn't false humility, or an attempt to flatter Serena, merely a fact. Vampires were especially talented in hemomancy, and pure-blooded ones, like Serena, were unrivaled hemomancers, a power that thrived in their very essence. Eric, who had been turned by Serena herself, had inherited some of that power, but he was all too aware that his own skills in hemomancy could never rival hers so long as her blood was purer than his. Serena watched him, a faint smirk of amusement on her lips. At least you're honest. Don't get used to it, Eric replied, his voice tinged with a dry humor. Then, his expression shifted, a cocky glint lighting up his eyes behind the mask. You're gifted in blood magic, but I'd bet I could still school you in any other field of magic. Serena's eyes narrowed in mild irritation, her lips pressing together in a barely contained smirk. She wanted to counter Eric's self-assuredness, but pride kept her from making too much of a fuss. She had watched him enough to know his talents were nothing short of exceptional. He wielded magic with an almost reckless ease, seamlessly blending spells from every school and merging even the most obscure incantations to create effects that surpassed anything she had seen in her long life. Yet, Serena wasn't about to admit defeat so easily, not when there was a better way to sidestep his smugness. That Caden, he's not half bad, she muttered, a tinge of reluctant approval coloring her tone as her gaze returned to Caden. He's nowhere near my father's skill with a blade, but he has promise. She watched with interest as Caden deftly sidestepped a Thalmor soldier's strike, spinning his sword and delivering a swift, clean beheading. Blood arced in the crisp morning air, a fleeting stain against the pure snow. Is that why you brought him along? She added, casting a sidelong glance at Eric. Eric merely shrugged, watching Caden's handiwork with a detached, almost assessing eye. Useful people ought to be put to good use, he replied. I see potential in him: discipline, skill, and more importantly, grit. I'm thinking of taking him into my service. The suggestion was almost offhand, but Serena could tell he meant it. She knew Eric's undead minions were tireless soldiers, but they lacked finesse, limited to following orders as they were, and unable to interact with the living. Caden, however, was different. As long as Eric guided and trained him well, he could become an invaluable asset, one whose reliability and discretion would complement Eric's more intricate plans. Serena crossed her arms, casting Eric a thoughtful look. But what if he's unwilling? Her voice was mild, but her eyes sparkled with intrigue as she watched Caden finish off another Thalmor, the blade driving smoothly into the elf's heart. Eric's expression shifted to one of wry amusement, a smirk playing on his lips. Then we'll part ways amicably. I'm not foolish enough to force someone into my service only to end up with a knife in my back for my efforts. Serena snorted, rolling her eyes in that familiar way that hinted at both irritation and amusement. If the Thalmor are as powerful and influential as you say, then he won't last long on his own anyway. They'll hunt him down without mercy. Eric gave her a dismissive wave, clearly unconcerned. If he's not one of mine, then his fate doesn't affect me. With that, he began striding forward, boots crunching over the frozen ground as he headed for the heavy doors leading into the fort's interior. Enough about him. We have more pressing matters. Serena shook her head, casting him a half-smile as she followed, the faint creak of the iron-bound door mingling with the echoes of her footsteps. Meanwhile, Jerry trotted alongside, his tiny legs churning with enthusiasm as he sniffed at the lifeless corpses strewn around. His tongue lolled as he panted, stopping here and there to inspect the fallen elves with something approaching puppyish delight. Your pet seems unusually excited about our company, Serena noted, nodding toward Jerry, whose stubby legs carried him around the scene with boundless energy. He gave a bark of satisfaction, nudging at a corpse with his nose. Jerry's a connoisseur of carnage, Eric said with a smirk, giving the corgi an approving pat on the head. Nothing makes him happier than a battlefield full of corpses to sniff around. Isn't that right, boy? Jerry barked again, the sound sharp and echoing in the cold air as he bounced after Eric and Serena. He weaved between their legs, moving just ahead with his stubby, determined trot, as if leading them himself into the fort. Judgment number 47. Deep within the dungeon of Northwatch Keep, Eric stood before an Altmer mage cloaked in black robes, his presence exuding an almost tangible darkness. Slowly, Eric pulled off his mask, letting the Thalmor mage see the cold amusement in his eyes. For a mere Thalmor mage, you sure gave me more trouble than expected, Eric said, glancing down at the scorch marks smudged across his gauntlets. Not far behind, Caden was catching his breath, slumped against the stone wall, sweat slicking his face. The struggle with the Thalmor mage had pushed him to his limits, and for a moment, it looked as though the mage might have killed him. Only Eric's timely intervention had prevented that, stepping in to shield Caden and neutralize the threat. In the tight quarters of the dungeon, where the Altmer couldn't rely on numbers to overwhelm them, Caden had proven himself against the scattered Thalmor soldiers Eric had intentionally left for him. Yet, against this particular mage, something felt amiss. Serena lingered nearby, watching the mage with narrowed eyes. He's no novice, she remarked, her voice tinged with suspicion. But something feels wrong. Eric gave a slow nod, his gaze drifting to Caden. I noticed that too, he murmured, his eyes narrowing as he studied the drained warrior. Caden shouldn't have struggled like that. It's as if something was holding him back. After a brief pause, Eric dismissed the thought with a shake of his head. No matter. Let's finish up here. Our business is nearly done. He raised his hand, lightning crackling in his palm, casting flickering shadows on the dungeon walls as he prepared to end the mage's life with a single, decisive spell. Before he could release it, Caden's voice cut through the silence. Please, wait a moment. Eric's hand stilled, and he turned to Caden, one brow arched in mild surprise. What is it? Caden hesitated, looking down as he searched for the words. When he finally met Eric's gaze, the usual calm in his eyes had hardened into something darker. I'm ashamed to ask, but this man he tortured me for days. The reluctance in Caden's voice vanished, replaced by a fierce anger that flared brighter with each word. His gaze locked on the Thalmor mage, hatred simmering beneath the surface. Dying like this would be too easy for him. Eric's lips curled into a slow, predatory grin. He looked from Caden to the bound mage, considering the cruelty Caden sought. So, what you're saying is, you want this elf to suffer. His tone was chilling, an edge of amusement seeping through as he savored the prospect. Seeing the dark grin on Eric's face, Caden felt a chill crawl up his spine. There was something unsettling, almost predatory, in Eric's expression that made Caden question if he truly wanted to witness what was about to happen. But he couldn't back down now. After everything this mage had done, years of torment inflicted on prisoners, the sick pleasure he took in watching them break, this would be justice, or at least the closest thing to it in a place like this. It's only fair. He's the warden of this dungeon, Caden muttered, gripping the mage's robes and lifting him to his feet. The Altmer was no longer the arrogant overseer but a sniveling, broken creature, casting wild, fearful glances between Eric and Caden. And he took pleasure in torturing those he kept here. He deserves this. Eric gave him an approving nod. Good, good. Seems like you've caught your breath, so drag him along and follow me. Eric's tone was laced with dark amusement, the look in his eyes promising horrors that would make even necromancers recoil. Behind them, Jerry seemed to catch on to his master's excitement, trotting along with a high-strung energy. The corgi's nose flared as he sniffed the air, eyes locked on the mage with an almost gleeful hunger. The Thalmor mage recoiled, desperately trying to pull away, but Caden's grip held firm, shoving him forward whenever he hesitated. Intrigued, Serena watched Eric's calculated movements, a slight frown tugging at her lips. She stepped closer, her gaze questioning as she asked, "What exactly do you intend to do with him?" Eric glanced at her, the predatory gleam still dancing in his eyes. There are certain magics, rituals that reach into the oldest, darkest corners of our world, powerful and cruel rites I would hesitate to use, even on a cutthroat bandit. He paused, his grin widening as he turned his attention back to the trembling Thalmor mage being dragged forward by Caden. But for him. Eric's tone was merciless, each word heavy with cold satisfaction. I feel no reluctance. You reap what you sow, as they say. Serena sighed, a faint look of resignation crossing her face. I'm guessing this isn't something I'd like to see, is it? Eric chuckled, a dark gleam in his eye as he shook his head. It's not something anyone should see, he said quietly, his tone carrying a hint of grim amusement. He led the way down the dim corridor until they reached a small, enclosed chamber off the main hall. The walls were close and thick here, built to muffle sound, though Serena suspected they'd hear enough regardless. Eric stopped and turned to Caden. Throw him in, and if you really want to stay, you can. But fair warning, it won't be good for your mind, or your gut. Caden gritted his teeth, a shadow of lingering anger tightening his features as he dragged the beaten Thalmor mage forward. I want to see him suffer, he muttered, voice low but taut with conviction. I need to see him suffer. Eric gave him a nod, satisfied, while Serena watched them disappear into the chamber. She sighed, rolling her eyes. I'll wait out here, thank you very much. Her voice was light, but there was a hint of tension there, a slight frown creasing her brow as she glanced down the corridor. Eric chuckled, throwing her a look over his shoulder. Wise choice. He nodded to her before disappearing into the chamber. Left alone in the dimly lit hall, Serena glanced at Jerry standing beside her with his pale blue eyes fixed eagerly on the door. She smirked and said dryly, well, at least you'll keep me company, won't you, boy? But Jerry turned to look at her, and she could have sworn that in those intelligent eyes was an unmistakable glint of disdain. He gave her a huff that sounded suspiciously like a scoff, his tail wagging as he turned his back on her without a second thought, happily trotting into the chamber to join Eric and Caden. The door closed with a definitive thud, leaving Serena standing alone. She huffed and leaned against the wall, folding her arms. What kind of mud is that? But her light-hearted mutter died on her lips as a piercing, guttural scream erupted from the chamber beyond. It was a raw, hoarse cry, one that clawed up the stone walls and into the darkness with the agony of a creature stripped of any dignity or control, his voice cracking under the force of pain. Serena's eyes flew open, and she found herself frozen, rooted to the spot as the horrified wails echoed down the corridor. She'd never heard such screams, not even in the dungeons of Folkihar Castle. She pressed herself against the wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she tried to ignore the sounds echoing through the hall. Another scream followed, harsher and more desperate, the Thalmor's voice sounding more animal than man. The door swung open with a low, creaking groan. Caden stumbled out, his face pale and ashen, dark circles under his eyes. He barely managed to get a few steps before dropping to all fours, his entire body shuddering as he heaved, spilling the contents of his stomach onto the cold stone floor. The nauseating sound echoed through the dimly lit hall, and for a moment, Caden was lost in the harsh, sickening aftermath of what he'd just witnessed. Serena watched him with a calm, detached interest, one brow arched as he slowly collected himself. When Caden finally rose, he groaned, wiping his mouth with a trembling hand. I pity that elf, he managed, his voice hollow and unsteady, as if the words tasted bitter on his tongue. Serena's eyebrow arched even higher, her gaze cool as she took in his disheveled state. Funny, she remarked, her voice edged with dry amusement. Weren't you the one who was so eager to see him suffer? Caden shook his head, still looking slightly dazed. And yet I pity him now, he replied, a shadow of pain flickering in his eyes. That alone should tell you the extent of horror inflicted in that room. Serena paused, a faint spark of curiosity crossing her expression. She hadn't wanted to know at first, but Caden's reaction intrigued her. What exactly did Eric do in there? She asked, her tone softer, though her words carried a hint of reluctance. Caden shuddered, his jaw clenching. Trust me, you don't want to know, he replied, and the way he said it, the hollow, broken sound in his voice was answer enough. He took a shaky breath, swallowing hard as he regained his footing, his expression darkening as he forced himself to straighten. I'll need to find my armor and weapons, he said at last, his voice steadier now. And I'll make sure to free the others here. He met her gaze briefly, a flicker of residual horror still in his eyes. I'll see you later. He turned and walked away, his steps heavier, each one carrying the weight of what he'd witnessed. The dim corridor swallowed him up, his figure fading into the shadows until Serena was left alone once more. She turned her attention back to the closed chamber door, her mind turning over what she'd seen and hadn't seen. The silence that filled the dungeon was thick, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that suggested more than simply the absence of screams, it was the silence of a place drenched in misery, a place where fear had worn into the stone like old bloodstains. The screams had ceased, but Serena doubted that meant Eric had stopped his work. More likely, the Thalmor mage was simply beyond the ability to scream anymore. She leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, her mind drifting to Eric. He was complicated. The cruelty in him was unmistakable, a shadow that lingered over him like the silent promise of a storm. And yet, his cruelty wasn't reckless. He wielded it like a blade, honed and precise, disciplined and patient, albeit tinged with some recklessness. From the moment she'd met him, she'd recognized that his wasn't the senseless violence of someone who killed for the thrill. He wasn't a monster who acted out of pure enjoyment, he was controlled, deliberate. Even when he first awakened as a vampire, he'd kept his thirst restrained, curbing the bloodlust with a level of self-control she rarely saw in others of his kind. Whatever he was doing inside that chamber, she doubted it was solely for his own amusement. Eric's mind worked in layers, and his actions rarely seemed to serve just one purpose. As she pondered, Jerry trotted out of the chamber, his fur slightly ruffled but his expression as content as ever, like he'd just come from a pleasant stroll rather than a scene of utter horror. He trotted up to her with a cheerful gait, tail wagging as he regarded her with those piercing blue eyes, glinting in a way that was almost mischievous. "Just what are you, mutt?" she muttered with a shake of her head, crouching down to scratch behind his ears. Jerry responded with a huff, his gaze darting back toward the chamber door, clearly unfazed by what he'd witnessed. She chuckled, though it was a mirthless sound, her hand lingering on the corgi's scruff as she fought back a wave of dark curiosity. Eric might have ended that Thalmor mage in a dozen different ways, each quicker and simpler than what she imagined he'd chosen. Instead, he'd drawn it out, making it as much a punishment as an execution. Still, the sinister magicka emanating from within the chamber made it clear that it was neither. He was clearly performing a dark ritual of sorts, as to what purpose, Serena had no idea. Another sound broke the silence, the faintest scuff of footsteps, and then the door opened. Eric stepped out, his face calm, unreadable, though there was a slight tension in his jaw that suggested he wasn't entirely untouched by what had taken place within. He closed the door behind him with a quiet finality, as if sealing away something best left unseen. Serena straightened, arching a brow as she crossed her arms. "All done, then?" she asked, her tone casual, though her eyes were searching. He met her gaze with a nod, a faint, humorless smile flickering at the corner of his lips. "A fitting end for a man who reveled in suffering," he said simply. There was no pride in his voice, no satisfaction, just the casual tone of someone who had carried out a necessary chore. He didn't look back at the door, his focus already shifting forward. Serena's lips twisted into a smirk, though it was tempered by a slight frown. "It certainly sounded memorable," she replied, half joking, though the echo of those screams lingered in her mind like a distant memory. Eric's smile remained, cool and enigmatic. "He'll linger in his memories of it, even in his afterlife, I'd wager," he said, his tone light, though his words held an edge. He turned and started down the hall, his steps unhurried, leaving the remnants of his dark work in the shadows behind him. "Come along," he added without looking back. "We've finished what we came for." Stepping into the open yard of Northwatch Keep, Eric took in the grim scene before him. Freed prisoners huddled in small groups, tending to one another's wounds with shaky hands and hollow eyes. Most of them were Nords, their faces weathered by hardship, bearing the unmistakable look of survivors. Some wore the hardened expressions of warriors, muscles taut even under the bruises and bloodied skin. But a handful looked out of place, men and women who clearly had never wielded a sword, and whose calloused hands likely belonged to miners, farmers, and simple craftsmen. They wore expressions not of stoic resolve but of confusion, and even shame. Eric's eyes traveled over the group, taking in the scars that lined their faces and limbs, the heavy marks of torture that left some bandaged or hunched in pain. But it was the ones missing limbs, a hand here, an eye there, a leg gone from just below the knee, that made him pause, his jaw setting with a slow, simmering fury. These civilians, who likely had nothing to do with the ongoing wars or political maneuvers, had been maimed, permanently marked, rendered vulnerable and helpless. Behind him, Serena caught up, her gaze flicking over the prisoners with a mixture of sympathy and disgust. "Looks like they've had their fill of Thalmor hospitality," she muttered, her tone dry. Eric's expression darkened. "The bastards knew they couldn't hold them here for long," he said, his voice low. "Not without stirring up trouble with the Empire. But they wanted to leave a mark, something that would cripple them for life." He clenched his jaw, his gaze fixating on one older man missing his right hand, now awkwardly trying to wrap a bandage around another prisoner's arm. The task was nearly impossible with one hand, but the old man persisted, his eyes burning with stubborn defiance. Eric's anger twisted into something sharper, cold, bitter purpose. Torture was one thing, but to cripple these people, to leave them defenseless even upon their release, was nothing short of cruelty for cruelty's sake. Beside him, Jerry whined, his ears flattening as he sniffed the air, sensing Eric's simmering anger. The corgi paced slightly, never straying far but alert, his hackles raised as if he too understood the wrongs inflicted here. Eric looked down at the corgi, his gaze softening for a brief moment before he turned back to Serena. If there was ever a sliver of doubt about what I did to that warden, he said quietly, this would have burned it away. The Thalmor couldn't destroy the Empire through war, so they resorted to dismantling it, piece by piece. Serena's mouth pressed into a thin line, her gaze hardening. The Thalmor aren't just waging a war on soldiers, she said softly, almost to herself. Maiming one or two fishermen and farmers might not make a big impact, but if they've been doing this for a long time, and on a larger scale. A few yards away, Caden emerged from the crowd, his face pale but resolute. He joined them, casting a quick look at the prisoners he had helped free, many of whom gave him nods of gratitude. He met Eric's gaze, his expression grim. They're ready to move out, he reported, his voice steady despite the recent horrors he'd witnessed. But a lot of them won't make it far on their own, especially if the Thalmor sniff us out and give chase. Eric's gaze turned cold as he scanned the prisoners before settling his gaze back at Caden. There's no need to worry. The Thalmor won't have the leisure to chase after these people. I'll give them something else to worry about. Masks and Theatrics number 48. Otter's note, I think overdid Eric's lines at the end a bit, but he's a skald, Viking for something like warrior poet, and I figured he needed to be a bit poetic from time to time. Serena watched Caden and the line of weary prisoners slowly fade into the distant snowy horizon, a thin shiver of movement against the bleakness of the landscape. When their silhouettes finally vanished from view, she turned to Eric with a raised eyebrow, arms crossed against the cold. Well, that didn't take long, she remarked dryly. The righteous anger you were burning with just disappeared the moment they left, didn't it? Eric chuckled, a low, mirthless sound that floated into the stillness. Anger is a mask, one that I shed as easily as this, he replied, reaching up and lifting Rogget's ancient mask from his face. Beneath it, his expression was calm, composed, almost indifferent. Serena noted the unsettling detachment in his gaze and tilted her head, studying him. So, that was all for a show? She asked, her tone curious rather than surprised. Eric shrugged, his eyes drifting over the empty, snowbound courtyard. I haven't truly felt anger in a long time. Maybe I feel irritation now and then at foolishness or unfounded arrogance. But anger, fear, they're relics of a different life. He glanced down at Rogget's mask in his hand, his fingers tracing the deep grooves carved by time. It's a mask, one among many that I must wear to appear more human than I am. He paused, the silence stretching between them. He didn't elaborate on how he'd become this way, but Serena could tell there was more to it than he let on. Ever since the failed ritual that had left him with Eric Deathshong's memories, thousands of years of life condensed into one mind, his emotions seemed dulled, certain things almost muted within him. Fear, anger, even joy, they were present, but distant, as if experienced through glass. Eric's eyes, pale and intense, met Serena's, and a faint smile curved his lips. Caden saw the power I could wield, the ruthlessness, the cruelty, he said softly. But power alone doesn't lead. It intimidates, it frightens, but it doesn't inspire. He needed to see something different today, my anger, not for myself, but for others. My strength, not just as a weapon, but as a shield. He glanced toward the distant horizon, where Caden and the prisoners were now no more than shadows in memory. People, unlike vampires, don't follow power alone. They follow purpose. They follow conviction. Caden, he's no different. Serena raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the turn of his thoughts. So, what is it, then? This conviction you carry around like a shield? You clearly didn't give them so much money for travel expenses and even promised to provide them work out of the goodness of your heart. Eric gave a casual shrug, his eyes tracing the path the freed prisoners had taken. Caden aside, those prisoners aren't completely useless. Many of them were warriors, mercenaries, people accustomed to hardship. And with the Thalmor dogging their steps, well, they won't need much convincing to follow a new cause. Serena let out a small sigh, crossing her arms as she watched him with a calculating gaze. Winning them over is easy enough, show them a touch of kindness, and they're yours. But you did more than show a bit of kindness, Eric. You freed them, gave them a direction, a reason to keep fighting, she said, her tone carrying a note of curiosity. So, tell me, what do you plan to do with them? Eric's mouth curved into a slow, satisfied smile, a spark of ambition lighting his eyes. I've already mapped out their path, he replied smoothly. They'll make their way to Morthal first, where my housecarl can help any weary souls settle. They've had enough bloodshed, no need to force them into more of it if they don't wish to fight. Serena raised an eyebrow, both intrigued and a little skeptical. And for those who do still wish to fight? Eric's smile widened, a flicker of calculation sharpening his gaze. They'll go to Riften. I own a significant stake in the mines there. My gold will fund a new beginning for them, a mercenary company led by Caden himself. He let the words hang, letting Serena consider the implications. They'll build their strength under his command, growing in number and experience. And when I call on them, they'll answer. Serena studied him, her expression neutral yet observant. So, it's not just power you're after, she murmured. It's a foundation, a network. Eric nodded, clearly pleased she understood his intentions. Precisely. Riften's in need of structure, something more disciplined than the chaotic cutthroats running loose. With Caden leading them, the mercenaries will gain purpose and unity, serving as both shield and sword for my aims. She arched an eyebrow. You've certainly thought this through. I suppose that also includes restoring your ancestral fort, the one you told me about. Indeed, he replied, a glint of anticipation in his eye. My clan's old stronghold, Snowhawk Fort, is still standing, though barely. It needs more than skeletons if I'm to turn it into a true stronghold of power and influence. Once it's restored, it will be a source of wealth, and it will be home to those of the prisoners who are weary of fighting. She observed him in silence for a long moment, her curiosity mingled with a faint trace of admiration. And Caden? What did he make of all this generosity? Eric chuckled softly. Caden's wary of me, of course. But he's also grateful. He sees what I've done for the prisoners, and while he may question my motives, he knows I'm giving them and him a chance they never would have had otherwise. Serena's brow furrowed as she looked out over the snow-dusted yard, observing Eric's meticulous planning with a wary skepticism. It seems you've accounted for almost everything, she murmured, but what about the Thalmor? They're not ones to simply forget their prisoners, much less allow Caden and the others to walk away so easily. They'll be hunted. A sly grin tugged at the corner of Eric's mouth. He chuckled darkly, casting her an amused look. Ah, that's the easiest part, he replied. Just watch. With a snap of his fingers, a host of figures appeared out of the shadows, summoned to his side as if answering an ancient call. Surtur, the towering flaming skeleton, Heelrith, the Death Knight, and a line of 20 skeletal warriors emerged, each of them kneeling in unison before him, their ghastly forms exuding an eerie aura that shimmered against the snow. Eric snapped his fingers again, and in a flash of dark energy, a mound of items materialized beside him. Potent alchemical ingredients, glowing sprigs of death bell, crimson nirnroot, black soul gems scattered at his feet, alongside skulls from all manner of beasts and men, some cracked and others still bearing traces of flesh. Get to work, he commanded, his tone authoritative yet cool, while mentally sending a series of instructions to his undead servants. At once, the skeletons began to move, their hollow eye sockets flaring with faint magical embers as they took to their tasks with mechanical precision. Serena, intrigued but still puzzled, crossed her arms and raised a brow. What exactly is all this about? Eric waved a dismissive hand, his eyes gleaming with something darkly gleeful. Just be patient, and you'll see. The skeletal soldiers moved with quiet efficiency, dragging the Thalmor corpses strewn around the yard and stacking them in the center, their gauntlet hands grasping flesh and armor alike with a cold indifference. Meanwhile, several skeletons gathered Eric's collection of soul gems, scattering them strategically throughout Northwatch Keep, some buried just beneath the frozen ground, others stashed in hidden alcoves and darkened corners of the keep, where their latent energies would remain dormant but powerful, amplifying the aura of dread Eric intended to create. Those tasked with alchemy meticulously ground down the more exotic ingredients into fine, pale powders. Death bell, frost salts, bone meal, each substance became a whispering dust mixed with Thalmor blood, brought to Eric's hand as he began crafting intricate circles and sigils across the yard. He painted them on the ground, smeared them along the stone walls, and even traced patterns up the wooden beams, each line radiating with dark, old magic. While the skeletons worked, Surtur and Heelrith disappeared into the keep's shadowy halls, returning moments later carrying a thick, charred wooden pole. At its center, the skeletal remains of the prison's warden clung to it, interwoven with the wood as though the man had been consumed by it. His robes tattered and soaked in his own blood draped around the pole, his hands twisted and bound to it, while his bloody skull sat at the top like a grim crown. It was a grotesque totem, a warning as much as it was the heart of the ancient spell Eric was about to cast. With slow, deliberate steps, Eric took the totem from Surtur and planted it in the center of the courtyard, anchoring it firmly into the frozen ground. The Thalmor warden's hollow skull stared down, an eternal scream frozen in its empty sockets. Serena's eyes lingered on the totem, and an unreadable expression flickered over her face. It's not just a deterrent, is it? She asked, a trace of wary fascination in her voice. Eric's lips curved into a satisfied smirk as he placed his hand on the cold, blackened wood of the totem. A deterrent, yes, he murmured, but far more than that. As he channeled his magicka into the totem, a wave of arcane energy shot outward, fanning across the ground in an explosive ripple. The closest magic circles flared to life, glowing fiercely as they drew in the magicka, amplifying and strengthening it. Tendrils of power surged through the keep, lighting up one soul gem after another, each one pulsing in rhythm like an eerie heartbeat. From the soul gems, the energy arced back into the outer circles, binding them into a cohesive web of dark magic that crisscrossed the keep in a dense, intricate design. The skull at the top of the totem burned with an unnatural green light, illuminating the courtyard with a sickly glow, and from within its hollow eye sockets, a thick, putrid fog began to seep, coiling and spreading like a living shadow across the keep's walls and over the corpses littering the ground. Eric took a step back, his eyes gleaming with excitement, the shadows playing across his face as he raised his hands theatrically, his voice a commanding echo that cut through the fog. Arise! At his command, the corpses of the fallen Thalmor soldiers trembled, their bodies contorting grotesquely as they were pulled back into a twisted semblance of life. The once proud elves now moved like puppets, their limbs stiff yet unnaturally strong, their eyes empty, but smoldering with green flames that mirrored the light from the totem. Their expressions were masks of horror, forever frozen in the twisted agony of their last moments, and as they staggered forward, a strange reverence seemed to overcome them. And worship. Eric's voice resonated with a dark authority, and as if compelled by his words, the risen Thalmor undead turned their attention to the base of the totem. Moving as one, they shambled forward, positioning themselves around the totem in a silent, reverent circle, each one dropping to its knees and bowing, their heads pressed to the cold, hard ground. In response, the totem shone even brighter, the green light intensifying until it cast long shadows that danced across the walls. Then, from the ground behind the totem, the thick, sprawling heap of bones drawn from Eric's private stash in Snowhawk Fortress began to tremble, like something alive was buried within it, eager to break free. The skeletal remains shifted and clattered, bones sliding and snapping together as if an unseen hand was molding them into shape. With a deep, rumbling groan, a massive bone Goliath began to emerge, piecing itself together bit by bit, its colossal form towering over the kneeling undead. Its skull bore a jagged crack, and its eye sockets glowed with the same unsettling green light, giving it a twisted, predatory intelligence. Its spine and limbs were reinforced with overlapping layers of ribs and femurs, forming a crude yet menacing armor. Once fully assembled, it loomed over the courtyard, a grotesque behemoth of skeletal power, its hollow gaze sweeping across the landscape. And then another Goliath rose, and a third, each one larger than the last, a legion of titanic sentinels bound to Eric's will. They moved into position, standing guard over the totem, a wall of unbreakable bone and enchanted stone. Serena watched with a strange mixture of horror and fascination as the eerie display unfolded. She couldn't deny the raw power of Eric's magic, but even to someone as accustomed to the dark arts as she, the spectacle was chilling. "What are you building here?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though fearing to disturb the reverent silence that had fallen over the undead. Eric let out a slow, measured breath, his gaze fixed on the flickering lights that cast an eerie glow over his creations, animating them with an almost grotesque semblance of life. "A bastion," he murmured, his tone reverent yet edged with a chilling satisfaction. "A roaring bonfire that will lure the Thalmor like moths, each one drawn to the flames of their undoing." He extended a hand toward the prostrating undead and the towering bone Goliaths, the spectral fires in their hollow eyes mirroring his own dark intentions. His voice dropped to a near whisper, yet it carried through the silent ranks with a weight that even the dead seemed to heed. "Their wings will burn," he intoned, his words like a spell, low and fervent, "and yet they will not stop, relentless, driven by the shame of defeat and their own arrogance. They will throw themselves into the flames until they, too, are turned into fuel for my flames." Eric's eyes gleamed as he looked over his growing army, his jaw set with the fierce satisfaction of a conqueror who had laid claim to death itself. "This keep will be a place where the arrogance of the elves meets the patience of the dead," he said, a dark smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "They will find no redemption of honor here no matter how they seek it. Only despair." Folkihar number 49. The boat rocked gently over the dark waves of the Sea of Ghosts, a chill breeze whipping through the air as Eric and Serena journeyed towards the distant shore. Two undead skeletons, their empty eye sockets fixed forward, rowed with rhythmic precision, propelling the boat forward in eerie silence. Eric broke the quiet with a low hum, his voice rolling into song. "There once was a hero named Ragnar the Red," he sang, his tone light-hearted as he gazed past Serena. "He came riding to Whiterun from Oeli-Rarikstead." Serena, sitting quietly, wore a faraway look, her expression a mixture of contemplation and unease. Noticing, Eric raised an eyebrow and paused his singing. "What's on your mind?" he asked. She sighed, meeting his gaze. "I keep thinking about that totem you left in Northwatch Keep. I've seen plenty of dark magic, but never anything quite like that." Eric tilted his head, surprised by her hesitation. "Why didn't you ask about it sooner?" Serena rolled her eyes, giving him a knowing look. "You were too absorbed with your grand performance. There wasn't exactly a chance for questions afterward." A grin broke across his face. "You know what they say, theatrics are the spice of life." He gave an exaggerated shrug, then added, "But since you asked, the totem is my own creation. It combines ancient rites from the Reach Witches and rituals I've pieced together from old allied texts. Their clans were once masters of certain, evocative spells when they ruled parts of Black Marsh." Her eyes narrowed as she studied him. "You've done your research when it comes to necromancy. I think you and my mother might have gotten along. There was a faint sadness behind her words, a glimmer of something long buried and bittersweet. Eric met her gaze, his expression softening. She sounds like a fascinating woman. I'd be honored to meet her. A bitter smile tugged at Serena's lips. I remember her that way, but it's been thousands of years. She looked away, and for a moment, her eyes were distant, haunted by memories neither of them could touch. Eric watched her carefully, but only gave a slight shrug. Either way, we'll just have to wait and see, won't we? He trailed off, his gaze shifting past her as he raised a finger towards the horizon. Looks like we've arrived. Serena turned to look. Just ahead, the silhouette of an ancient watchtower loomed over the water, its crumbling stone walls etched against the grey sky. It stood alone atop a rugged island, rugged cliffs rising up like jagged teeth from the sea. The boat glided smoothly into the shallows, scraping to a halt on the rocky beach as Eric and Serena disembarked. Serena kept Jerry secure in her arms, her gaze fixed on the landscape ahead. Before them, an arched bridge stretched across a narrow chasm, flanked by foreboding gargoyles on either side, their faces locked in eternal snarls. Beyond the bridge loomed a dark, imposing castle, its blackened stone walls veiled in a shroud of mist that clung like cobwebs to its ancient turrets. The sight of it stirred something deep within her, though her face remained mostly unreadable. Serena let out a faint, weary sigh. Here it is, home sweet castle, she muttered, her voice touched with a hint of resignation. Eric's gaze swept over the ominous structure, and he couldn't help but raise an eyebrow in admiration. I thought this place would be grand. He gestured broadly, taking in the jagged towers and misted battlements. This is something else entirely, albeit a bit time-worn. The fact that you were too modest when you described it didn't help either. She rolled her eyes, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. I didn't want you thinking I was one of those, she replied, a bit self-consciously. You know, women who sit idly in their castles all day. She paused, looking down. Honestly, this place never really felt like me. It might sound strange, but I hope you can believe that. Eric chuckled, giving her a reassuring grin. For what it's worth, I think it's impressive. Dramatic, even. But I suppose a place like this would cast quite a shadow. Serena shook her head, letting out a short, humorless laugh. Shadow is one way to put it. She turned to face the bridge. It's something, all right. They crossed the bridge slowly, their footsteps echoing against the stone. The mist seemed to thicken around them, swirling ominously as they neared the castle gates. Ahead stood an iron draw gate, its bars ancient and rusted, held in place by a sturdy wooden frame. Behind it, an elderly man sat hunched in a high-backed chair, casting a scornful look in Eric's direction, his lips curling in irritation. Begone, stranger! The old man barked, his voice thin but filled with a surprising intensity. You're not welcome here. Eric said nothing, merely turning to Serena with an amused look, raising an eyebrow as if to ask, do you know this cranky gatekeeper? Serena shook her head, just as puzzled as he was. But then, the man's gaze shifted, his eyes squinting as he looked closer at her face. His expression transformed instantly, the impatience and disdain melted away, replaced by stunned recognition. His thin lips broke into a wide, toothy smile, and his eyes sparkled with excitement. He scrambled to his feet, pointing towards her. Lady Serena! He cried out in a wavering voice. Lady Serena has returned. Open the gate. The cry echoed through the mist, and from somewhere within the castle, chains rattled as mechanisms creaked into motion. Slowly, the iron gate began to lift, groaning as though it hadn't moved in centuries. Eric raised an eyebrow, smirking as he turned to Serena. Quite the warm welcome, he said, drawing out his words theatrically before giving her a deep, exaggerated bow. After you, your highness. Serena shot him a withering look, though a faint smile hinted at the edges of her lips. Oh, stop it, you, she muttered with a sigh. She took a breath, her expression turning more serious as she glanced at the imposing gate now fully raised before them. Listen, before we go in. Eric's expression softened, and he tilted his head slightly. You all right? He asked, his voice low and genuine. Serena hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully, before nodding. I am. I think so. Her voice was steady, but her eyes reflected a deep conflict. And, thank you. For everything, for getting me this far. But once we're inside, I'm going to need to go my own way for a bit. There's a lot wrapped up in this place, she said, her gaze drifting toward the darkened doorway ahead. Things I haven't dealt with in a long time. And I don't think you're quite ready to handle them, either. Eric nodded, offering her a gentle smile. Fair enough. Take the lead, then. With a nod of appreciation, Serena placed Jerry gently on the ground, and the wolf padded along beside her as she stepped forward. Eric followed at a respectful distance, observing as she seemed to brace herself with each step. They entered through a narrow stone hallway that led to a grand balcony overlooking a massive dining hall below. The room was vast and dimly lit, an eerie warmth emanating from the torches that lined the walls and the massive iron chandelier suspended overhead. Rich red carpets lined the hall in 3 columns, stretching the length of the room. 2 long tables were arranged horizontally in the center, laden with jeweled goblets, gleaming silverware, and bottles of dark wine. Among the table settings were well-dressed human thralls, some seated, others lying atop the tables as if part of the morbid decor. Eric's gaze took in the fancifully dressed vampires lounging at the tables, their pale faces cast in shadow, expressions of detached amusement or indifference on each. They drank casually from goblets, some glancing up as Serena descended the staircase with Eric a step behind her. Only the grand table at the far end of the hall, situated opposite the balcony, remained empty save for 2 figures standing behind it with silent, watchful eyes. Both wore regal but somber attire, their dark expressions adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Ving Almo and Orthjolf, Harkon's primary advisors, stood on either side of an ornate, high-backed chair carved from ebony wood and inlaid with crimson gemstones. At the very center of the hall stood Lord Harkon himself, his lips curling into a self-satisfied smile as Serena's approach brought his glowing eyes to life. Dressed in royal vampire armor adorned with intricate, darkly beautiful patterns, he looked every bit the monarch he fancied himself to be. His gaze flickered briefly to Eric, his smile momentarily tightening before it returned to Serena with possessive pride. Harkon's voice cut through the silence like a blade, smooth yet carrying an unmistakable authority. "My daughter, at long last, you have returned." He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his piercing gaze never leaving her face as his expression turned steely. "I trust you have brought my Elder Scroll." Serena's frown deepened, her brows knitting with visible irritation. "After all these years, that's the first thing you ask me." Her voice was laced with bitterness, and she barely restrained herself as she ground out, "Yes, I have your precious scroll." A ripple of whispers spread through the vampires gathered around the tables, shock and awe passing like a wave among them. "She has the scroll. After all this time. I can't believe it." "The Elder Scroll." Harkon's lips curled into a thin smile, a mixture of condescension and amusement dancing in his eyes. "Of course, I am thrilled to see you, my daughter. Must I say the words aloud?" He gave a slight, dismissive shake of his head, feigning disappointment. "Ah, if only your traitorous mother were here. I'd let her watch this reunion, before putting her head on a spike." The veiled threat hung in the air, his words carrying a sense of cruelty that made Serena's eyes flash with anger. Harkon's gaze slid to Eric, his interest piqued as he studied him carefully. "Now, tell me," he continued, a chilling curiosity in his voice, "who is this stranger you have brought into our hall?" Serena turned to Eric, her gaze softening just a fraction as she spoke. "He's my savior. The one who freed me." Harkon's eyes narrowed as they fell upon Eric's staff, a flicker of intrigue crossing his face. There was something unusual about this stranger and he didn't like surprises. "For my daughter's safe return, you have my gratitude," he said, though his tone carried little warmth. "Tell me, what is your name?" Eric inclined his head respectfully, though his eyes held Harkon's without flinching. "My name is Eric Deathsong, and you must be Lord Harkon. Serena spoke of you often." At this, Serena fought to keep her expression neutral, though her brow twitched slightly. She had mentioned her father to Eric in their travels, but none of the words she used to describe him were particularly flattering. A smirk tugged at Harkon's lips, his eyes glinting with amusement as he scrutinized Eric. "Then you must know who and what I am by now." "Who we are?" Eric's gaze remained steady. "Vampires. Amongst the oldest and most powerful in Skyrim." His voice was calm, carrying no hint of fear or reverence as if simply stating a fact. "And you are their king, one of the most powerful beings to walk these lands." Harkon laughed, a booming sound that echoed through the hall, drawing the attention of every vampire present. "Indeed." He looked down upon Eric with a kind of cold, regal satisfaction, clearly intrigued by Eric's lack of fear. "As a reward for bringing my daughter back, I would offer you my blood and a seat at our table." He let the offer linger in the air, watching Eric's face for any flicker of interest or hesitation. "But," he added, his gaze sliding back to Serena, a predatory gleam in his eyes, "it seems Serena has taken it upon herself to reward you already." Eric raised an eyebrow, his gaze flickering between Harkon and the assembled vampires before he asked with a hint of wry humor, "So, will that be a problem?" Before Harkon could answer, Serena interjected, her voice firm. "Eric has earned my trust and friendship. He's proven himself more than capable during our journey." She leveled a steady look at her father, her tone making it clear that her support for Eric was unwavering. Harkon chuckled, his laughter echoing around the grand hall with a mix of amusement and mild condescension. "Oh, I don't doubt your words, Serena." His gaze shifted back to Eric, scrutinizing him with a touch of curiosity. "But as you may or may not know, everyone here was given the blessing of the night by me, personally." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, his gaze never leaving Eric's face. I'm sure you can understand why accepting you when you were turned by Serena, rather than by me might cause concerns. Doubts among my retainers. Eric sighed, his expression calm but sharp. Well, the fact that I haven't been kicked out of the castle or tied up on the dining table tells me there's a way to assuage these doubts. His tone was pointed, challenging without being disrespectful, and it brought a flicker of interest to Harkon's eyes. Indeed so, Harkon replied smoothly, nodding in approval. You simply have to prove your capabilities and your loyalty. Do that, and all here shall welcome you with open arms. Eric gave a single, decisive nod. Then tell me what I must do. A gleam of satisfaction lit Harkon's face as he studied Eric, his smile widening as though he had just found a worthy piece in a game he enjoyed. I like your eagerness, Eric Deathsong. With that, he turned to one of the vampires seated further down the table, a dark elf whose calculating gaze was fixed on Eric with a faintly sinister curiosity. It's time, Garan, Harkon commanded, his voice carrying an edge of authority. Bring forth the chalice and explain to our new friend here what he must do. Webs upon webs number 50. Eric turned the chalice over in his hands, noting the cold, weighty metal and the spikes curling out in patterns both jagged and elegant, framing intricate engravings that seemed to pulse faintly with a sinister energy. The black and gold vessel was almost regal, but with a dark edge befitting the Folkihar clan. So, Eric said, his voice dry, I need to go to Redwater Den in the rift, find the blood spring beneath, and fill this chalice with its essence. Garan Marathai gave a slow, approving nod. That is correct, he replied, his voice calm but edged with a cautionary tone. Though I must warn you, Redwater Den is no ordinary lair. It's a refuge for the less reputable members of society. Skooma fiends, feral vampires, and other dregs of mortal and immortal alike. You may find the company there unpleasant. Eric allowed himself a half smile. That's quite all right. I think I can manage a few feral vampires and skooma-addled vagrants. The edges of Garan's mouth lifted slightly as if he too found amusement in Eric's confidence. Your resolve is admirable. But remember, the den is a dangerous place, and many who enter it do not return. He paused, letting the warning sink in before adding, Our Lord expects only the strongest to succeed. Eric's brow lifted in mild surprise. How soon do you expect me to finish this task? Garan's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. There is some time. We won't require the blessing for 5, perhaps 6 months. He folded his arms, a flicker of intrigue crossing his face. Now that Serena has returned with the scroll, our Lord is eager to set his plan into motion. Of course, certain considerations must be met before the stage is fully prepared. Eric felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth, though he kept his expression neutral. Of course, Harkon would need time. Even though it was something that could be done in a few in-game days in the game. The memories he had of the game's storyline came to the fore, and Eric quickly analyzed how different the real experience would be. In the game, he mused, the Dragonborn's initiation with the Bloodstone Chalice was a swift affair. Harkon personally taught them the intricacies of vampiric power, including the vampire lord form. Filling the chalice was only the beginning, and upon returning, Harkon would declare he'd been spreading rumors of an Elder Scroll appearing in Skyrim to lure Moth Priest to their doorstep. But Eric knew that would hardly be so possible in reality. For one, the journey to Redwater Den itself was no small feat. It would take him across a sizable stretch of Skyrim, deep into the rift, and back, which was over a month's journey by foot or horseback alone. Not to mention, the subtleties of spreading rumors to reach even the ears of the secluded Moth Priests would take time, far more time than simply playing a few scripted lines. Eric slipped his hand into his cloak, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the chalice before securing it in a hidden compartment. He nodded at Garan, his expression serious, concealing the truth in his words with practiced ease. I'll endeavor to complete the task as soon as possible, he said evenly, watching the elf's face for any signs of suspicion. Soon as possible, he mused internally. Not if I can help it. His mind was already forming a plan to delay the mission as long as he could. Every moment he could stall would buy Iran time to rally the Dawn Guard, recruit able fighters, and amass the resources they'd need to stand against the Folkihar. As his mind drifted to Iran, Eric's lips twitched in amusement. Imagining the man's usually stoic face twisted in rage after his little prank, was enough to make him chuckle, but he held back the urge. Despite the deception, Eric knew Iran would move on, fueled by his undying vendetta against vampires. Garan Marathai, evidently pleased by Eric's apparent eagerness, nodded approvingly, his thin lips stretching into a small, almost smug smile. That would be for the best. Our Lord appreciates expedience. Eric bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement. Then I'll take my leave at once. He turned away, scanning the hall for Serena, but as he expected, she was nowhere to be found. Like in his memories of the game, she had vanished into the shadows, her departure as silent and sudden as her presence. He shook his head, amused by her elusiveness. She'll turn up eventually. Eric set a course for the exit, his steps echoing off the cold stone floors of the vast hall, eager to leave behind the scrutinizing gazes of the Folkihar vampires. The atmosphere in the hall was oppressive, filled with an air of ancient malevolence, and Eric felt the weight of countless watchful eyes that seemed to size him up as both potential ally and prey. Just as he neared the great double doors, a figure swept in front of him, blocking his path with a regal, deliberate step. Ving Almo. The tall Altmer vampire's sharp, angular face was set in a practiced expression of haughty amusement. His dark eyes, glinting with the cold arrogance typical of his kind, assessed Eric with the air of someone appraising a new, perhaps unwelcome, addition to their collection. Leaving so soon? Ving Galmo's voice was smooth, laced with a faint, condescending amusement. He tilted his head, studying Eric as if he were a curiosity that had wandered into his presence uninvited. One would think a fresh initiate would be eager to familiarize himself with his new family. Ving Galmo's smug expression dropped instantly as Eric brushed past him without so much as a sideways glance. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filling the room like a storm cloud ready to burst. A faint flush of color, rare for a vampire, crept onto the Altmer's face, his hands twitching as if ready to reach out and seize Eric by the collar. Rage contorted his expression, his lips parting to deliver what would no doubt be a venom-laced threat, yet he hesitated when a loud, mocking chuckle echoed through the hall, breaking the tension with an almost palpable snap. From the shadowed edge of the hall, Orthjolf, who had been watching with silent amusement, leaned forward and called out, his deep voice tinged with a biting satisfaction. "Well done, kinsman. Seems you have keen eyes," he jeered, his words laced with a deliberate arrogance as he glared at Ving Almo. Nothing good would come from mixing with an elf. Their kind has always been. But Eric didn't so much as slow his stride, and he continued forward without acknowledging Orthjolf's commentary, his eyes fixed on the heavy doors that led out of the hall. The Nord vampire's voice died off mid-sentence, his cocky smirk faltering as Eric passed him by without the slightest hint of acknowledgement. Orthjolf's expression shifted from surprise to barely masked irritation, and he clenched his jaw, his pride visibly stung. Around them, chuckles and whispers echoed through the hall like leaves rustling in a windstorm, a mixture of surprise, amusement, and barely hidden malice. From one corner, a young vampire muttered to his companion, "Did you see Ving Galmo's face? Like a frostbite spider caught in sunlight. He treats them both like gnats," another snickered, "not even worth swatting. Perhaps we have a wolf in our midst, or a fool." But no one looked more pleased than Garan Marathai himself, the dark elf vampire who stood a few feet away, his face shadowed with an expression that could only be described as satisfied indifference. Watching the petty jabs and bruised egos of the court held little allure for him. He served Lord Harkon, and whoever ruled this castle was of little consequence to him so long as he kept his position. Yet, in this moment, he couldn't help but admire Eric's boldness in handling the situation. To move through Castle Folkihar with such calm disregard for these so-called primary advisors. Garon's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "He's either foolish or very powerful, either way, I ought to keep an eye on him." Meanwhile, Ving Almo and Orthjolf seated, their rage palpable as their smug exteriors crumbled, replaced by a raw irritation at being brushed off like nothing more than dust on Eric's cloak. They exchanged a brief look, a silent pact forming in the glint of their eyes. Their bruised egos demanded satisfaction, and the new vampire who had shown them such disdain would not be easily forgotten. But Eric barely noticed, his gaze fixed on the grand doors that loomed ahead. Behind him, his loyal companion Jerry trotted dutifully, the Krogi's blue eyes glinting with their own knowing disdain as he occasionally glanced back at the vampires with a look that was unmistakably challenging. The hound's presence at Eric's side made an impression all its own, a small ordinary creature among vampires, yet disdain was apparent in Jerry's narrowed gaze as he eyed those around him. He seemed even more arrogant than Ving Almo, Orthjolf, and even Eric himself. The whispers faded as Eric reached the doors, pushing them open and stepping out into the cold night air with an unbothered calm. The dead man's drink had a subdued warmth that seemed almost out of place in the bleak, mist-laden town of Falkreath. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows over the tavern's patrons, who sat scattered around, sharing quiet conversations and stolen glances. Eric, seated on a sturdy wooden stool near the bar, took a slow, thoughtful sip from a bottle of mead, savoring the smoky sweetness that softened the chill of the night outside. Across from him, Valga Vinicia, the imperial tavern keeper, polished a mug with her usual air of boredom. She looked up as Eric placed a few gleaming coins on the counter, the metal catching the light and reflecting in her eyes. "Say," he began, giving her an easy smile, "I'd wager a tavern keeper like yourself hears all sorts of rumors in a place like this. Any chance you'd care to share a few?" Valga's lips twisted into a grin as she deftly pocketed the coins. "You've come to the right person," she said, leaning in a little. "In Falkreath, if I don't know it, then it ain't worth knowing." She gave a knowing wink before adding, "Though for a man like you, I'd wager you already know most of what goes on." Eric nodded, matching her grin. "Flattery is as easy on the ears as it is on the mouth, though that's not what I'm paying you for. Tell me, what's been happening around Skyrim?" Anything I ought to know? Valga drummed her fingers on the counter, considering. Oh, all kinds of shenanigans, of course. This is Skyrim, after all. But there's one tale in particular I reckon you'll find interesting. Just the other day, word came down about a vigilance outpost up in the Reach getting absolutely torn apart. Eric raised an eyebrow, keeping his expression neutral though his interest had been piqued. He had almost completely forgotten about the two arrogant vigilants he met at Stendar's beacon. Looks like the seed I planted finally sprouted, he mused. Out loud, he said, really? An entire outpost destroyed? There must have been a lot of casualties. Valga gave a grim nod, crossing her arms. Strange business, that. They said only 2 vigilants were stationed there when it happened and so only 2 died, and apparently, the outpost was ravaged by hundreds of Daedra, or so I've heard. She shook her head with a wry smile. Seems like they might have poked something best left alone. Or maybe they just met someone who wasn't in the mood to play nice. Eric took another slow sip of his mead, concealing a grin at Valga's words. She didn't even know how close her tavern gossip came to the truth. He glanced back at her, but the subject was already losing its appeal. Thinking on it now, his actions seemed almost childish. There was no guilt over what had happened to the 2 arrogant vigilants, just the faint realization that his reaction had been a bit unnecessary, a response to the empty words of 2 zealots with more pride than sense. Shrugging off the thought, Eric leaned in again. What else is happening around Skyrim? Valga hummed thoughtfully, her finger tracing absent-mindedly over a knot in the bar's wood. Well, here's an odd one, she said, lowering her voice as if for dramatic effect. They say undead creatures have been spotted wandering Hafingar's shores. Rumor has it they crawled out of some old ruins. Supposedly, the place was a secret prison used by the Thalmor, if you can believe that. She chuckled and shook her head, clearly amused by the absurdity of it all. Eric raised an eyebrow, feigning a skeptical scoff. Sounds like mad talk to me. Despite the dismissive tone, a thrill sparked within him. The totem he had placed in Northwatch was working perfectly, raising undead along the coast and unsettling the locals. It wouldn't be long before the Thalmor felt compelled to investigate, stumbling headlong into his carefully planted trap, only to suffer more casualties. If fortune favored him, they might even encounter the Folkihars and clash, unwittingly creating a tangled web that could stall both the vampires and the Thalmor. If that didn't happen, well, he could always use the Thalmor's distractions as a handy excuse for his leisurely pace in fulfilling Harkon's task. Valga watched his expression, apparently disappointed by his lack of reaction, but her bemusement quickly returned as she rifled through her mental list of rumors. I know. Sounds too wild to be true, right? She laughed and moved to wipe down the bar. But let's see, what else is floating around these parts? Valga's eyes lit up, the gleam of fresh gossip illuminating her expression. Oh, right, there was that. Eric leaned in, feigning greater interest than he truly felt. Now this one sounds promising. Valga grinned, obviously enjoying the audience. You know Nurlian, right? The old Altmer who runs that alchemy shop in Windhelm. At his nod, she laughed, amused by her own story already. Of course you do. It's strange enough that a high elf would settle down in Windhelm of all places, especially with the Nords there being, well, the way they are. But to think they'd even let him set up shop. She shook her head, her voice trailing off before she dove back in. Anyway, rumor has it he hired a group of mercenaries and set out to claim some legendary alchemical relic hidden in a cave. And you know what? The old man actually succeeded, only to find out the relic was broken beyond repair. Eric barely resisted a sigh, keeping his expression neutral as he mused to himself, why is it that every rumor seems to tie back to me? Am I weaving too many webs? He kept the thought to himself and leaned in slightly, keeping up the charade of interest. Oh? So, what did he do when he found out? Valga's eyes sparkled with delight, and she laughed. Oh, he threw the most almighty tantrum. Stormed around like a raging bear, then ended up paying the mercenaries, wait for it, a measly 5 septims. Can you believe it? Just 5 coins, when there were more than 20 of them. If his apprentice hadn't come to their aid and paid them something fairer, the old grouch would have been torn limb from limb. Eric let out a laugh, shaking his head. Sounds just like him. I've crossed paths with Nurlian before, and his temper's a thing to behold. Valga sighed, a wistful look settling over her face. You must be an adventurer, hey? Traveling around and living life like the heroes in the tales. Her wistful tone turned wry. I envy people like you sometimes. But then I remember I'd probably end up in some frostbite spider's stomach before I'd make it more than a mile out of Falkreath. She gave a half-hearted laugh, shaking her head at her own sense of adventure. Anyway. So, will you be staying in Falkreath for a while, or is this just another stop along the way? Eric looked around, taking in the dim warmth of the tavern and the faint scent of pine seeping through the walls. I think I'll stay a while, he said, a slight smirk crossing his face. My travels have taken me from one frozen wasteland to another, marshes to more snow, and then back again. I think my eyes could use a bit of Fakriatha's vibrant greenery to lift my spirits. Valga chuckled, giving him a friendly nod as she wiped the counter again. Well, you came to the right place. You need anything else, you know where to find me. Eric nodded and settled back into his seat, letting the clamor of the tavern drift over him, content to let the world slow down, at least for tonight. Silence, my brother number 51 humming to himself as he strolled along the woodland path. Eric's deep voice carried the familiar words of an old tune. Syrah was never an agreeable girl, her tongue told. Jerry trailed along happily, sniffing at the mossy ground and weaving between tree roots with boundless enthusiasm. The little corgi's nose dipped and darted through patches of wild flowers and tangles of green vines, clearly delighted by the scents of the forest and the soft earth under his paws. Eric chuckled, his eyes flicking down to watch Jerry's antics, and kept on humming, the lyrics rolling from memory. But she was so fast, so quick with her bow. He muttered the words more to himself now, the rhythm of the tune guiding his steps as he veered off the beaten trail, slipping into the shadowed embrace of the deeper woods. After a few minutes, Eric found himself in a secluded hollow wrapped in a thicket of jagged rocks. Moss-covered boulders and the face of a small, natural cliff loomed over him, casting the area into a shadow that seemed deeper than it should have been. It was an unremarkable place at first glance, just a lonely clearing with a gnarled old tree and a small, still pool of water nestled among the stones. To anyone passing by, it would have seemed like an unassuming nook of nature. But Eric knew better, there was something hidden here, something that no ordinary traveler would notice. With a knowing grin, he stepped toward a particular spot among the rocks, his eyes catching on the faint outline of a dark door obscured within the cliff's face. It was well concealed, nearly swallowed by the shadows and rock formations around it. The door was stark, adorned only with the engraved image of a pale skull. There was no handle, no keyhole, nothing that would indicate it was even a door at all, just the smooth, carved face staring out from the stone, as if it were a mural painted to blend in with the cliffside. He reached out, pressing his hand against the cold stone. The skull's hollow eyes began to glow with a faint, eerie light, illuminating the shadows as if they held secrets of their own. A low, hoarse voice reverberated from within the stone, almost like the whisper of the wind in a crypt. What is the music of life? Eric's grin widened, and without a moment's pause, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, yet clear and firm, the melodious quietude of silence, my brother. A heavy silence hung in the air, as if the forest itself held its breath. Then, slowly, the glow in the skull's eye sockets dimmed, and the same low voice echoed once more, welcome home. With a quiet chuckle, Eric watched as the outline of the door began to shimmer, the rock seeming to ripple like water before fading away entirely to reveal an open passage. He glanced back at Jerry, who tilted his head, giving the dark entrance an intrigued sniff before trotting in ahead of him. Stepping through the hidden doorway, Eric found himself in a stone chamber lit by flickering torches set along the walls. The air carried a faint scent of incense mixed with damp stone, reminiscent of the many Nordic crypts he'd explored across Skyrim. Yet, this place was different. It was meticulously clean, the floors swept and the walls devoid of any cobwebs or dust, a stark contrast to the ancient tombs he'd seen, where decay was as common as dragware. To his left, a modest alcove with a single wooden bench sat neatly tucked against the wall, perhaps a spot for meditation or quiet waiting. Ahead, a narrow stone staircase descended into deeper, hidden corridors. So, this is the Dark Brotherhood's sanctuary, he muttered under his breath, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Surprisingly, it's just as I remembered it. His voice trailed off as he glanced around, the reality of the moment setting in. He knew he'd have to tread carefully here, this was no game, and he wasn't merely an adventurer. Just as he began to take in the surroundings, a whisper of movement alerted him to a presence at his side. He spun around, just in time to see a figure materialize from the shadows, quick and silent, like a ghost emerging from the darkness. The figure was a woman, dressed in dark red leather armor, her face mostly obscured by a cowl and a muffler. Only her sharp, focused eyes gleamed through the shadows, watching him with cold, lethal intent. In one swift motion, she raised a curved dagger, the dark blade glinting as she lunged at him, a deadly blur aimed straight for his throat. Instinct took over. Eric's eyes widened, but his hand shot out, a surge of magicka flowing through him as he cast a telekinesis spell. The spell took hold, freezing her mid-lunge, and her body hung suspended in the air, caught inches from her intended target. She glared at him, her eyes narrowed, unyielding in the face of his magic. Well, that's one way to say hello, he murmured, a smirk tugging at his lips. The woman showed no sign of backing down, instead, she twisted her arm just enough to reach into her belt, withdrawing 3 small, glinting throwing knives. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she hurled them toward him, her hand moving with a deadly precision. But Eric was faster. With a jerk of his wrist, he sent her flying sideways into the stone wall. The impact echoed through the chamber as she hit the wall with a dull thud, her knives clattering harmlessly to the ground. Before she could gather herself, Eric lifted his other hand, and in an instant, a staff appeared in his grasp, its tip glowing faintly with a paralyzing enchantment. He pointed it at her, releasing a pulse of magic that surged forward and struck her like a silent command. Her body stiffened, the paralysis spell taking hold, leaving her unable to move. Eric lifted Astrid higher, pulling her closer as she glared, her fierce eyes blazing with defiance. Her jaw clenched, fury emanating from her as she struggled against the invisible force holding her still. Eric raised an eyebrow, amused, and murmured, "You must be Astrid." "A pleasure." She narrowed her eyes, attempting to spit out a curse, but the paralysis spell held her speechless. He chuckled at her restraint, nodding approvingly. "Good choice. If you have nothing pleasant to say, silence serves just as well." With Astrid still suspended in the air before him, Eric began his descent into the sanctuary, her frozen form floating just ahead like a prize on display. Each step echoed down the stone staircase, the sound mingling with the faint drip of water trickling somewhere below. The corridor opened into a spacious chamber, more impressive than he'd imagined. Though not much differed from the Nordic crypts scattered across Skyrim, this one held a different energy and air of secrecy layered with shadow and a faint tang of decay. In the center of the chamber ran a narrow, glistening stream, cutting through the stone floor and disappearing into the darkness. On the right, a tinted window bearing the ominous skull of Scythes overlooked the area, its empty eye sockets watching over the sanctuary like an unblinking judge. To the left, a small clearing held a frostbite spider, its glossy eyes fixed on him with a strange, predatory interest. But Eric's gaze was drawn to the ancient word wall at the far end of the chamber, its carved runes seeming to pulse with latent power. He'd have to study it once his business here was concluded. He hadn't fully taken in the sight when a sudden shout broke the stillness. "Everyone, come quickly. We have an intruder. He's got Astrid." The voice belonged to an Argonian assassin, his sharp eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of Astrid, helpless in Eric's magical hold. A ripple of tension filled the room as assassins emerged from hidden alcoves and shadowed corners, surrounding him in a semicircle. Each one was armed and ready, though they held back, eyes flicking nervously to Astrid as they considered their options. An imposing reguard dressed in a Likar garb held a scimitar poised to strike. Beside him, an elderly imperial robed in black and red armor glowered, staff at the ready. A lithe dark elf woman with a calculating gaze watched him closely, her dagger glinting in the dim torchlight. Even a young girl stepped forward, though her eyes glowed an unnatural red, her stance was deceptively relaxed. All were ready to fight, yet it was the little girl who caught Eric's attention. Her nose twitched, her face paling further as her crimson eyes locked onto his with recognition and dread. She didn't seem as eager to fight as he fellows, instead, her gaze spoke volumes, her small mouth parting slightly as if she understood exactly who, or rather what, Eric was. A low murmur rippled through the assassins, some casting uneasy glances at one another as they weighed their chances. Eric's gaze swept across them, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Quite the welcoming party. I didn't expect the whole family. Though I must say, it's nice of you all to come out and greet your new master." Festus's eyes narrowed as he leaned in closer to Eric, his scornful expression barely disguising his disdain. "What in oblivion are you blabbering, boy?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "We only serve Scythes here, so unless you want me to turn you upside down with my magic, I suggest." Before Festus could finish, a fierce voice cut through his tirade. "No one has time for your long-winded speeches, Festus," growled the Nord standing nearby. The man stepped forward, his glare fixed on Eric, and his tone held an edge that was unmistakably personal. "You release my wife at once, or I will make you suffer." Eric turned his gaze to the Nord, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. He could sense the man's barely contained rage, his scent touched with the unmistakable musk of a beast. With a smirk, he tilted his head. "Ah, you must be Arnporn," he mused, his tone condescending. "I heard you were kicked out of the companions some time ago." His eyes swept up and down Arnporn dismissively. "Tell me, how exactly do you plan to make me suffer?" A vein pulsed in Arnporn's forehead as his fury escalated. His teeth bared, his eyes darkening as he let out a menacing growl. Without a word, dark fur erupted along his arms and neck, his body contorting and stretching as he began his transformation into a werewolf. "Wait! Don't!" Babette's small voice rang out in alarm, her pale face even whiter than before as she took a step back. But her warning came too late. Arnporn, fully transformed, lunged toward Eric, his claws extended, his eyes blood-red with rage. Eric's smirk only widened at the sight. "I suppose an example is due for others to fall in line." He snapped his fingers, and instantly, two towering figures materialized by his side, Heelrith and Surtur, their skeletal forms towering over everyone present. Behind them, 10 more skeleton warriors emerged, their soulless eyes flickering with a spectral light. With eerie coordination, Heelrith and Surtur moved as one, each grabbing one of Arnporn's muscled, fur-covered arms and slamming him to the ground. Arnporn snarled and writhed, his claws scraping against the stone floor, but the skeletons held him firmly in place, their grip unyielding. Eric's gaze bore down on Arnporn, his smirk sharpened with mocking disdain as he said, "You're not remotely as capable as you believe yourself to be, little pup." He lifted his hand, and flames flickered to life, casting a fiery glow that danced ominously across his face. "Perhaps you should consider your own standing before you threaten your betters." The flicker of murderous intent in Eric's eyes wasn't lost on the gathered assassins. Weapons tensed in their hands, and they began shifting forward, everyone, that is, except Babette, whose small form remained unmoving, her crimson gaze fixed on Eric with an unsettling clarity. As they prepared to act, a sudden clattering of bones filled the chamber. Eric's skeleton warriors emerged from the shadows, one stepping forward with a sword raised, the blade's tip grazing Astrid's neck as a wordless warning. The others spread out, skeletal hands ready to defend Eric's position, cutting off any possible movement. Arnporn's snarl turned to a pained roar as Eric unleashed his spell. Flames leapt from his hand, wrapping around Arnporn, consuming him in a blaze that turned his fury to anguished cries. The others watched, frozen in horror, as the fire reduced Arnporn's body to ash, his thrashing form illuminated in grim detail until the flames faded to silence. Eric's satisfied gaze lingered on the assassins as he said, "Now that we've established what happens to insolent fools, let's move on to business." Eric's eyes scanned them with a chilling calm, settling briefly on Babette, whose face paled at his faint smirk. A shiver ran down her spine, her stillness betraying that she alone seemed to grasp the full depth of Eric's threat. He continued, "From now on, you do as I say, and you do it to the letter. Otherwise, you die." His tone grew softer, yet somehow more lethal. Excruciatingly. The assassins exchanged wary glances, a subtle undercurrent of defiance simmering beneath the fear. But none of them dared step forward. It was Nazir who finally broke the silence, his dark eyes narrowed in cautious suspicion. "I don't know how you found this place," he began slowly, "or what it is that you truly want, but there's an order to these things." His gaze flicked around, searching for any support among his brothers and sisters before looking back at Eric. "We follow the 5 tenets. We have our pride and tradition to follow. You can't just waltz in and demand obedience." Eric met Nazir's challenging stare with a chuckle, a sound as cold and cutting as the northern winds. "Oh, please." He scoffed, his voice dripping with mockery. "You don't have the Night Mother, nor a listener. The Dark Brotherhood's days of glory are long gone." He let his gaze drift lazily around the chamber, taking in the faces of the remaining assassins, shadows of the Brotherhood's former strength. "This is the last sanctuary of a once feared order," he continued, his words carrying the weight of finality. "And you're nothing more than common cutthroats, scavenging through the ashes. You take on petty contracts, barely worth the price of a dagger, for vagrants and jealous lovers. It's pathetic." Silence settled heavily over the sanctuary as Eric's words hung in the air, harsh and damning. Nazir's face hardened, but he remained silent, his jaw clenched as he weighed his response. None dared to move, each assassin visibly grappling with the bitter truth Eric had laid bare. Blood number 52. Eric leaned back with a smirk as he looked around the room, taking in the wary, suspicious stares of the Dark Brotherhood's assassins. Their faces ranged from shock to guarded resentment, and Eric relished every tense second. "Now that we've established the stick, it's time for the carrot," he thought, suppressing the smug amusement curling at his lips. Clearing his throat, he said in a rich, commanding voice, "There's no need to despair. After all, I'm here now." Gabriella, a lithe Dunmer with piercing red eyes, sneered and gestured toward the burnt body of Arnhorn and the bound Astrid. Her voice laced with sarcasm, she asked, "And what more could you possibly do for us?" Eric's chuckle echoed through the sanctuary, low and mocking. "What can't I do?" he countered, his voice dripping with confidence. "For one, I can elevate the Brotherhood. As it stands, Maven Blackbriar is the only big fish who considers you worth even the barest bit of her time, and let's be honest, she barely lifts a finger for you as it is." His eyes swept over them with a challenging glint. "And that's because, right now, you're little more than dregs that would amount to nothing more than a nuisance to the true powers of Skyrim." Nazir, standing just to the side, felt a chill run down his spine. The way this stranger knew their names, their sanctuary, and their alliances, it was unsettling. This man wasn't a lost traveler or a luckless wanderer who stumbled into their lair. No, this Eric had purposefully walked through their doors. Nazir's fists clenched, and he couldn't keep the suspicion from his voice as he asked, "And how, exactly, do you plan to elevate us?" Eric's grin widened, and he raised a brow, folding his arms in a gesture that suggested he'd been waiting for this question. "Through connections, of course. Maven Blackbriar is already my business partner. If I vouched for you, she'd not only give you more business but would be willing to introduce you to others of her ilk, the true big fish of Skyrim's underworld." A wave of murmurs rippled through the assassins at his words. Eric's eyes glinted as he continued, "But it doesn't end there. Connections are only half the equation. You'd need the skills and discipline to handle the sort of jobs these new alliances would bring. As you are now, let's just say you'd need some improvement. Eric's gaze drifted to Babette, the ancient vampire in a child's body, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. He gave her a slow, meaningful nod, one that promised far more than he said aloud. She shivered, her eyes widening slightly, as if she understood the potential Eric was hinting at. The ancient hunger in her gaze met Eric's own, a flicker of excitement mingling with the darkness. Turning back to Nazir, Eric spoke with an air of finality. But we'll get to that in due time. For now, just know that I'm not here to bury the Brotherhood. I'm here to raise it. His eyes scanned each assassin, resting on their uncertain faces. And each of you has a choice: you can stay as you are, treading water, or you can follow me into the depths and emerge stronger, more dangerous, and truly feared. A tense silence settled over the sanctuary as Eric's words sank in. The tension in the room was palpable, and each assassin stood frozen, their eyes shifting between Eric and Astrid's now lifeless form on the floor. The dim torchlight cast flickering shadows over the room, giving the entire scene a twisted, surreal edge. It was Festus who finally broke the silence with a dry, almost sardonic sigh, muttering, "I'm too old for this." His gaze shifted to Eric, scrutinizing him carefully before adding, "If you can deliver on what you promised, I, for one, am willing to follow you. But you need to convince Astrid first. She's in charge here." Eric's eyes narrowed, a faint glint of amusement barely masking his calculating gaze. This old man is sharper than he looks, he thought. Festus sees where the wind is blowing, he's just waiting for the others to catch up. With a slight nod, Eric lifted his hand, releasing Astrid from the paralysis that held her rigid. "Now, Astrid," he said, his voice smooth and almost mocking, "let's hear what you think of my proposal." As the spell lifted, Astrid stumbled, barely able to keep her footing as she regained control. She took a breath, then spat out, "You son of a..." Before she could finish, the skeletal figure looming behind her clamped its bony hands over her head and twisted sharply. There was a sickening snap, and Astrid's words died on her lips as her body went limp, collapsing to the stone floor. Eric arched an eyebrow, feigning surprise as he turned to the rest of the assassins, who were staring in horror. His mouth curved into a smile with just a hint of contrition. "Dear me," he drawled, "what a clumsy creature. Allow me to make amends by disciplining it." He stepped forward, placing a hand on the skeleton's ribcage and, with a firm pulse of magic, shattered the skeleton into a heap of lifeless, bleached bones. Straightening, Eric looked around the room, his expression cool and composed. "Now then," he said, voice low and commanding, "it seems you'll need to choose a new leader. Given that Astrid has, sadly, passed in an unfortunate incident, I'd suggest Festus here. He seems the most experienced among you." The assassins exchanged glances, their initial shock slowly giving way to a tense acceptance. Festus exhaled slowly, a faint glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He saw a chance to rise to a rank befitting of his age and experience and took it. Still, he needed to maintain appearances. "You ask too much from an old man like me," he grumbled, his voice carrying the heavy weight of reluctant acceptance. "But if no one else is willing to step up..." His gaze swept the room, a silent dare to the others. "I suppose I can bear the burden." Nazir gave a resigned sigh, glancing warily at Eric. He had felt the full force of Eric's magic earlier and knew that further resistance could be fatal. "Festus has been with us a long time," he muttered, his voice thick with reluctant acceptance. "I'd say he's earned his place here." Gabriella crossed her arms, her sharp eyes narrowing at Eric as though dissecting him with her gaze. After a long silence, she finally nodded. "A wise choice, for now." Her tone held a warning, yet the agreement was clear enough. Vizra, the Argonian assassin, hissed quietly, his voice brimming with resistance. "If we're talking about age and experience," he said, shooting a skeptical glance at Festus, "then Babette is more suitable." At this, Eric turned to Babette, a wry grin curving his lips. "And what do you think of this, child?" He placed deliberate emphasis on the last word, knowing full well what he implied. He wasn't mocking her. Despite her age, the word, child, came naturally to him as he addressed her. Despite her small stature and youthful appearance, Babette had lived centuries, her experience etched in her sharp gaze. Babette's calculating eyes met his, and though she usually wore a mask of feigned innocence, and sometimes arrogance, something deeper flickered in her gaze. She understood what he was, not only in strength but in the timeless power he radiated. Her senses screamed at her that Eric was a fellow vampire, one far older, and more powerful than her. Her very nature would not allow her to oppose him, and so she obliged. The seconds stretched as she held his gaze, and then, with a faint smile, she shook her head. "I'm not interested," she said smoothly. "I'm far more suited to alchemy and the occasional contract. Leadership isn't for me." Her tone was respectful but assertive, and she allowed herself a slight bow, a display of deference and survival. Eric gave a short nod, acknowledging her decision. Wise choice, he replied softly. He let his gaze drift over each of them, his smile laced with a sense of finality. Eric's gaze settled on Festus, a glint of amusement lurking beneath his calm expression. Now, with that settled, it falls upon you to decide whether to accept or refuse my proposal, he said, his voice smooth and amicable, the words rolling off his tongue like a promise. Though his tone was friendly, the weight of his presence pressed on every assassin in the room, underscoring the fact that Eric had come with a purpose, one that would allow only one answer. Festus glanced uneasily around the dimly lit chamber, his gaze lingering on Astrid's still paralyzed form. He nodded at last, unable to deny the pull of what Eric promised. As I said, so long as you can deliver on what you promised. I'll follow your lead, he agreed, though his words held a note of hesitation. You claimed you can give us connections, which is one thing. But you also promised the Brotherhood a newfound strength, a way to carry out missions that have eluded us for decades. His eyes narrowed as he looked Eric over, assessing, probing. Can you truly empower us in the way you suggest? Why, of course, Eric replied with a slight incline of his head. Strength and eternal life, the means to enjoy your newfound power for centuries if you wish. All of it well within my reach. He spread his hands wide, his eyes glimmering with a dark allure. You have barely glimpsed what I can offer. Festus's brow furrowed in doubt as he studied Eric's face, the flickering torchlight casting shifting shadows on his expression. I don't mean to doubt you, he murmured, but this is Skyrim. Many claim power. Few actually wield it as they claim. I've seen powerful mages, but... He trailed off, clearly skeptical. Eric regarded him impassively, a chuckle rising as he held up a hand. Forgive me, this illusion spell is second nature by now. I sometimes forget I'm even wearing it. He waved his hand across his face, as if wiping a film away, and his pale features shifted, transformed. The room went silent. Eric's skin paled even further, deathly ashen and almost translucent, the veins below surfacing like faint cracks. His once blue eyes glowed an eerie, unnatural shade, bathing the room in a cold, unsettling light. It was as if the very essence of death had descended into their sanctuary. Even hardened killers like Festus and Nazir could only stare, discomforted by the quiet power that radiated from him. Without a word, he turned his gaze to Babette, who had watched the exchange in knowing silence. Babette offered a small, knowing smile as she stepped forward, breaking the tension in the room. He speaks the truth, she began, though she hesitated, studying Eric with a mixture of curiosity and recognition. Her gaze shifted to meet his, sharp yet cautious. Eric returned her look with a cordial smile. Eric Deathsong, he said, his tone calm yet carrying a weight that silenced even the most skeptical assassins. Babette nodded, her expression growing thoughtful. Lord Eric here is, a pure-blooded vampire, or at least directly sired by one, she clarified, glancing at the assembled assassins backslash. Her gaze returned to Eric, her eyes narrowing slightly as she noted his confident posture, the way he called over one of the skeletons with a flick of his hand, making it kneel before he casually perched on its back as if it were a throne. What's more, I'd wager he belongs to one of the ancient clans. The Folkihar, perhaps. She tilted her head, clearly testing the waters. Eric chuckled, giving a slow, deliberate clap. Very perceptive, child, he said, his tone filled with amusement. Your eyes are as sharp as your fangs. He inclined his head. I was embraced by none other than Lady Serena herself, daughter of Cold Harbor. I am the only one of her direct line, at that. This revelation sent murmurs through the group, as the gravity of Eric's lineage sank in. Babette's gaze flickered with a newfound respect, though she maintained her calm demeanor. Eric continued, his voice soft yet commanding, I can imagine some among you have considered the gift Babette carries, with all its powers and drawbacks, the sun, the feral hunger. But I offer a different legacy, one of purity. At this, Eric's gaze swept over the gathered assassins, his eyes calculating, noting those whose interest was piqued. No offense, Babette, he added, a faint smile tugging at his lips, but the thinness of your line's blood places it in the lower rungs of any vampire coven. Babette merely shrugged, unbothered, as if used to hearing the limitations of her bloodline. None taken, Lord Eric. I know my place, she replied, though her smile hinted at ambition. Still, the promise of greater strength and any relief from the sun's curse, well, that is enticing. All in due time, Eric said smoothly, his gaze shifting to the assembled assassins. For those willing, the power I offer is unmatched. You will gain speed and strength beyond what you've known, rivaling any vampire you encounter. Your skill in illusion, necromancy, and blood magic will deepen, and the sun will be a mere inconvenience. He smiled darkly, his voice a low, inviting murmur. Then again, what true assassin would need to stalk their prey in broad daylight? Eric's words hung in the air, as potent as any spell, and in that moment, he knew he had them, these assassins, these agents of darkness. Their loyalty could be his, bound by the allure of the power he wielded and the promises only he could fulfill. Last updated December 15, 2024.